Chapter 1931. His boss was forcing a good girl into prostitution. What should he do? Morality and life were in a tug-of-war. Xia Hanyang looked up at his secretary. Bring me the ink pad. He didn't want to sign his name, but his fingerprint was fine too. The secretary was speechless. His boss was forcing him into prostitution. Conscience and interests were in a tug-of-war. The secretary wanted to cry. He was just an employee. He felt like he had entered a mafia group. In the end, the secretary obediently brought the ink pad and retreated to a corner, pretending that he hadn't seen anything. After all, his eyesight wasn't very good, so he didn't see anything. Then Bai Weiwei watched helplessly as her fingerprints fell to the signature area. After so many years, Xia Hanyang had indeed grown. The bully's methods were more skillful. Xia Hanyang saw that the contract was signed, then looked up and revealed a nasty smile. How long is the contract? 250 million. Do you know how much it is? It's enough to buy you 100 lifetimes. She was delusional to think that the contract had a time limit. It didn't exist. A lifetime was too short. Xia Hanyang put away the contract, then said to his secretary, "Call my bodyguards and nannies. Come to the hospital to pack up and go home." With that, he suddenly lowered his head, held her face firmly, and kissed her hard. His attitude showed that he was treating her as his own. There was no trace of respect or shyness, only domineering strength. Then he stared at Weiwei Bai's hazy eyes. "You're mine in the future. Don't think about going anywhere until you pay off your debt." The attitude of a creditor was high and mighty. Weiwei Bai calmly wiped her lips, then suddenly lay on the bed and covered herself with the quilt. She said coldly, "I'm tired." Xia Hanyang wanted to reach out and pull her up. Other people's little lovers were all sucking up to their sugar daddies. How could there be such a lazy lover? But when he saw the tired look on her face, his fingers stiffly tugged at the quilt, but in the end, he covered her with the quilt. Then he took a few steps back. "Have a good rest. If your health is too bad now, I'll suffer a loss." With that said, he pointed at his secretary. The two of them went out. After they went out, Bai Weiwei and the system started to muffled laughter. "Weiwei Bai, selling yourself, ha ha ha, what era is this melodramatic drama?" The system said, "So this is the love-hate relationship between the contract lover and the dumb husky male lead? Ha ha ha." Weiwei Bai said, "We don't have to sell our hair for the time being." The system replied, "Yeah, but you'll have a sugar daddy in the future. Are you going to be a little white flower again?" Weiwei Bai was as calm as the wind. "No, I don't think Xia Hanyang will do anything even if I become a spirit." His most lethal move right now was to kiss her. Furthermore, when he kissed her, the fingers that were cupping her face were twitching nervously. It wasn't that easy to pretend to be a domineering CEO. At least, Xia Hanyang was too happy to be a bully. The system said, "I thought you would act pitiful and say that you went to jail for the sake of your morals. You said you didn't like him because you didn't want to implicate him." Weiwei Bai's shamelessness was well known. How could she let go of the opportunity to act pitiful? Weiwei Bai said, "I didn't have time to say it when I was strangled, and now it won't have much effect. He'll still hate me. 6 years. It was no longer a ravine that could be erased by her going to jail. Xia Hanyang's heart was too empty. Weiwei Bai had seen Xia Hanyang's extreme feelings for her during the time she spent with Xiang Yu. While he liked her, he also had a twisted hatred. // Chapter 1932. Back then, the surveillance video did not make Xia Hanyang so desperate. After all, Xia Hanyang was very optimistic and self-confident. even if she said that she did not like him once. He also had 10,000 reasons to think that she was coerced. Old Master Xiao even said in the surveillance video that he would send her to prison. So back then, Xia Hanyang knew that she did not like him, not only because of the surveillance video. It was because he grew up, his mind was clear, and he found the truth himself. The love of a teenager was crazy and confused. She made a simple affirmation. He could imagine that she liked him. But a person could not always be a teenager. When Xia Hanyang woke up and thought about it, he knew that she did not like him. Because to complete the side mission, she almost gave up on the main mission. So her so-called liking was full of loopholes. Wei Bai recalled the process of her strategy and could not help but say, Xia Hanyang hates me for not liking him, not for leaving him. So even if she said that she was in prison, besides getting a little sympathy, it would not help her situation much. The system could not help but sympathize and said, so don't leave. Try again and let him be happy. It sympathized with Xia Hanyang's miserable situation. Of course, the system knew that as long as Wei Bai could not leave the plane of the obsessed male protagonist, she could not get rid of him no matter where she went. Wei Bai nodded, this may be the best way now. I will try again and let him believe that I love him. Once Xia Hanyang felt love, he would definitely become a little mutt. Of course, the best way was to leave Xia Hanyang and take the money to live freely abroad. The result was that once Xia Hanyang caught her, he would not let her go and would die with her. So Wei Bai chose to stay for the time being. The system said, and you don't have to live on the streets. You will have a stable life in the future. Treat the male protagonist better. After all, he is a meal ticket. Wei Bai said, got it. I will treat him better. Then, the host and the system, who had plotted against each other, could not help but laugh out loud. Xia Hanyang's action was very powerful. He was afraid that Wei Bai would disappear. After confirming that Wei Bai was in good condition, he immediately took her home. Wei Bai realized that the house had changed. Maybe it was because Xia Hanyang had to work in a building in the city's business district for a long time. Therefore, the house was located in the city center and was very close to the business district. The housing prices here were sky high. It was estimated that this floor of the apartment would cost hundreds of millions of dollars. It was a very modern and cool decoration style. Xia Hanyang's swift and decisive character was displayed everywhere. After Wei Bai came in, feminine things immediately entered the room. In his black, white, and gray closet, half of the space was divided into dresses of various colors. A black suit and a skirt of soft colors crossed each other. It looked exceptionally beautiful and harmonious. In recent years, Xia Hanyang's mental misophobia had become more and more serious, and it had become a disease. There was not a single trace of anyone else in his house. It was so clean that it looked like an empty shell, more like a black and white graveyard. All these years, other than working, he had been looking for her. His life had been filled with these two things. He was like a walking corpse who had completely lost his soul. After Wei Bai was forced to go home by Xia Hanyang, she curiously looked for her own photos. Sure enough, as the system said, she found them in several places. On the dartboard, her photos were full of darts. In the gym, on the sandbag, the barbell, and the weightlifting machine were all pasted with her photos. Chapter 1933. What was even more terrifying was the wall of the study. Her photo was in black and white. So Xia Hanyang had been looking at her photo all these years to be able to work hard. Wei Bai silently wiped her cold sweat. She was lucky that Xia Hanyang didn't strangle her to death. She also didn't expect that the consequences of deceiving her feelings would make the victim hate her so much. After Xia Hanyang left her at home, he didn't show up for the first day. He didn't even come back to spend the night, but a nanny came to take care of her. Seeing the nanny's aged face, she remembered. Wasn't this the nanny who took care of Xia Hanyang 6 years ago? The nanny looked at her speechlessly. In the end, she really had nothing to say. She silently cooked her favorite dishes. Then, she packed everything up and left. Finally, she couldn't help but say, "Young master has a good heart. Live well with him." Then, she closed the door and locked it. This was Xia Hanyang's order. She couldn't have a chance to escape. At night, Xia Hanyang came back. He had a coat in his hand. The white collar was open, and there were traces of sweat on his neck. The system said, he just went to beat up his boxing teacher. Wei Bai, the nanny, also came back again. She bought a lot of vegetables and a lot of supplements. Xia Hanyang pretended to look at Wei Bai casually. He found her half lying on the sofa, reading a casual novel. She looked up faintly. Her eyes reflected the light. She looked at him like this. There was no intense emotion, but she was unusually focused. Then, she lowered her head to read again. She didn't resist or run away. Xia Hanyang, who had just vented his irritation in the boxing field, appeared again. He threw the coat to the nanny. Then, he turned around and went to the study. Looking at the black and white photo on the wall of the study, he was in a daze for a long time. Suddenly, he punched it. But it hit the wall and the photo fell down. Then, he endured the pain in his hand and put the photo away. The nanny came and went in a hurry. She only came to clean up the house, cook dinner, and keep the supplements warm before leaving. Wei Bai was very quiet. If Xia Hanyang wasn't sure that she couldn't open the door. He thought that she had run away. Xia Hanyang took several deep breaths in the study before he was sure that he had mastered the rhythm of his emotions. Then, he walked out with a cold face and searched for the first aid box. He applied ointment on the red wound on his hand and pasted a large elastic bandage on it. His back was facing Wei Bai and he did not look at her. His posture was arrogant and cold. Then he said, "Eat, lest you think I want to starve you." Wei Bai calmly put down the book and went to the dining table without any resistance. The housekeeper was very good at cooking. The dishes on the table were steaming hot and very appetizing. Wei Bai calmly picked up her chopsticks. Xia Hanyang suddenly threw the chopsticks on the table and raised his chin slightly. "My hand is injured. Come and feed me." Wei Bai held the bowl and looked up at him silently, which made Xia Hanyang lose his composure. Just as he thought that Wei Bai would reject him out of humiliation, Mo Tiange suddenly changed her mind. Wei Bai suddenly picked up a piece of meat and put it to his lips. "Eat." Her tone was very calm, but for some reason, there was a hint of sweetness in her voice. It was as if she was seducing him. Xia Hanyang felt that he might have gone crazy because he missed her so much. Even if she didn't do anything, he would think that she was seducing him. Xia Hanyang's eyes were hot and his lips were tightly pressed. After a while, he finally opened his mouth and ate. / button. Chapter 1934. Wei Bai didn't seem to think much about it. She lowered her head and put some rice into her mouth. She had just fed him, and then she ate with the same chopsticks. It was an indirect kiss. Xia Hanyang looked at her calm face. Didn't she realize how flirtatious this action was? Wei Bai ate some rice and then thought of something. She picked up some rice with her chopsticks and put it in front of his mouth. "Eat some staple food. You'll be hungry." Xia Hanyang looked at her calm eyes and finally confirmed that she really didn't know what flirtatiousness was. He didn't remind her. He ate with the same pair of chopsticks until he was full. After the meal, Xia Hanyang threw the tableware into the dishwasher. Then he said with a straight face, "I want to take a bath." Afraid that she didn't understand his hint, he emphasized again, "My hand is injured. Help me wash it." She was already his little lover that he had bought. So he couldn't do anything to her. Xia Hanyang repeated it dozens of times in his heart before he could say such shameless words with such a calm expression. Wei Wei Bai didn't think that he was shameless at all. She nodded and said, "Okay, I'll fill the tub for you." Xia Hanyang thought that she didn't understand what he meant. Did she think that it would be fine as long as she filled the tub for him? However, after Wei Wei Bai filled the tub, she sat by it and touched the water temperature with her fair fingers. "Take off your clothes. Remember not to get your hands wet. I'll wipe your body for you." Her attitude was too natural and peaceful. It didn't make him think of anything else. It was as pure and clean as an adult bathing a child. There was no flirtatiousness in her eyes. Xia Hanyang stiffened for a while before he reached out and unbuttoned his shirt in a huff. A few buttons flew out from his violent actions. Xia Hanyang stared at her blushing face and finally smiled smugly. She wasn't so indifferent after all. Proud of her hesitation, Xia Hanyang tore off his clothes and threw them out. He stepped into the tub with his long legs full of strength and sat down. The water surged up and splashed out. Wei Wei Bai's clothes were wet. She immediately wanted to get up. Xia Hanyang quickly grabbed her arm, making her dress wet. Her clothes were thrown away by him, so she could only wear the dress he bought. Wei Wei Bai wore the little white dress that he had chosen. It was as soft as a white dodder flower. She seemed to be a little distressed as she looked at her skirt. But he couldn't leave. Xia Hanyang gave her the towel and said with his back to her, "Wipe my back." He ordered her, but she could hear the nervousness in his tone. Wei Wei Bai held the towel and said to the system, "If I jump over, I don't know if I'll gain some trust." System, blocked. Wei Wei Bai didn't hear any response from the dog head system. He thought about it for a moment. It was not the right time yet. If he could obtain her body but not her heart, it would be a waste of effort. If she was too enthusiastic, Xia Hanyang would not believe her if she took the initiative in the future. So Wei Wei Bai scrubbed his back as if she was looking at a dead pig. //T. Chapter 1935. It seemed that her plan was to let him feel her softening and then fall in love with him. It wouldn't work. He wouldn't believe her even a little kindness. This series of thoughts was just a half-second contemplation in his mind. Wei Wei Bai's eyes flashed a trace of sober fierceness. She wanted to break Xia Hanyang's current heart defense. It was useless to be gentle. She could only break it open by brute force and fight to live. Only by doing whatever she wanted could she have a future. Therefore, when Xia Hanyang desperately wrapped his arms around her body and used violence to force her to obey him, Xia Xiaoluo was stunned. Wei Wei Bai's fingers scratched the skin on the back of his neck, and blood flowed out. Xia Hanyang's eyes became clear for a moment. At this moment, Wei Wei Bai had reached out and smashed the shower gel beside the bathtub on his head. Her previous resistance was suppressed by him. This successful attack made Xia Hanyang's eyes turn black for a moment, and his brain began to shake and he began to feel dizzy. Wei Wei Bai quickly pushed him away and immediately climbed out of the bathtub. But Xia Hanyang was like a beast out of the cage. He rushed over and reached out to grab her beautiful and delicate ankle. Wei Wei Bai gritted her teeth, raised her foot and kicked his inner thigh. Xia Hanyang frowned and took a breath. He gnashed his teeth and roared, "Wei Wei Bai." It seemed that he was going to eat her. He was going to eat her. Wei Wei Bai was almost eaten. She covered her chest with one hand. Her dress was torn and wet, sticking to her beautiful figure. She quickly opened the bathroom door and ran out. Xia Hanyang endured the pain, but he was still enchanted by her flying black hair and delicate and beautiful appearance. Without hesitation, he went out with fire all over his body. She couldn't run away. In addition to the key, the apartment was locked with his fingerprint. The key was with the nanny. She couldn't get out of this apartment at all. He cancelled the password because she might know it. He wouldn't take the risk of letting her run away again. Sure enough, he saw Wei Wei by trying to open the door. Her face was pitifully pale, and panic finally made her calm expression disappear. Seeing her like this, Xia Hanyang was actually excited and happy. Finally, he was no longer cold. Even if she hated him, rebelled against him, cursed him, or even cried her eyes out. Just don't look at him calmly. He did not want to be a toy in her eyes, nor did he want to be a dispensable plaything in her eyes. He would rather become the perpetrator and have absolute control over her life. He would never allow her to look at him with a calm expression again. It turned out that the most painful thing in this world was not having the person you love hate you. It was that he didn't care about himself. Not caring about him was the most vicious injury. Wei Wei Bai saw that she could not open the door and immediately gave up. Her lips trembled as she ran into the room. Xia Hanyang reached out and touched her long hair with his fingers, but he couldn't bear to hold it tightly. Instead, he let the long hair slide through his palm. He remembered that time when he sat behind her at the table. Every time he saw her long hair sweep across his table, that gentle and beautiful feeling. It gave him the urge to touch her. In the end, as a prank, he cut off a few strands of her hair, but he regretted it afterward. Because her hair was so beautiful. He still hid the handkerchief with her hair. He didn't know how to survive all these years. He didn't dare to look through her things. He sealed the house they lived in together, including the library that was full of her shadow. No one was allowed to open the lock, touch, or even move it. It was like a cruel box that was full of her traces. Chapter 1936. He didn't dare to open it. No one was allowed to touch it. Wei Wei Bai quickly ran into the room, immediately closed the door and locked it. She dragged the table over to block the door. Then she leaned against the edge of the table and wiped the water droplets off her face with relief before sitting down on the ground. Xia Hanyang's sudden outbreak of madness was really frightening. But Xia Hanyang, who was standing by the door, was not anxious at all. He unhurriedly stretched out his palm and sniffed it. It was the fragrance of her hair, so light that it was almost indiscernible. He couldn't help but hold his fingers and smile. The real her could really make his cold and dark heart come back to life more than anything else. He slowly walked to the door and knocked on it unhurriedly. Wei Wei, come out. I haven't finished showering yet. Wei Wei Bai didn't dare to say anything. He could even feel her nervous gasp. Xia Hanyang had never felt so powerful. He was too humble when he was a teenager. In his eyes, she was the winner who had absolute control over him. Now their roles had finally been reversed. It was his turn to control everything about her now. He would rather be the most terrible pervert and trap her with fear and violence than return to that humble time when he could lose her at any time. Xia Hanyang thought that she would keep hiding and not dare to say anything. He was very clear that he had scared her. But when he knocked on the door again, her slightly trembling voice came from the door. Xia Hanyang, calm down. I'm going to call the police. Xia Hanyang slowly revealed a smile. His tone was low. Oh, call the police. I'll give you my phone. Come out and get it. The communication equipment in the apartment had been broken and thrown away by him. The window glass was soundproof, and the apartment was high. She couldn't cry for help. Her best opportunity to escape was gone when he was in the hospital and his mind was unstable. They had just met again. He knew that in her eyes, he must be as stupid as he was 6 years ago. It was all a lie. He had to let her think that his character was similar to that of a teenager, that he could be reasoned with and fooled. That was why she didn't put up a strong resistance and tried to escape. But when she entered this place, he didn't need to pretend anymore because she didn't have a chance to escape. Xia Hanyang said gently, "Come out. You're my little lover now. You have to listen to whatever I say." His hands were completely different from his voice. She slammed the door violently. He clearly had the key, but he had to force her like this. As expected, Wei Wei Bai's voice finally broke. Her voice trembled, unable to maintain her arrogant indifference. "Xia Hanyang, I let you down 6 years ago, but you can't do this to me." Xia Hanyang's hand paused slightly. He couldn't help but laugh. "You're sorry." "No, how could you let me down? You clearly didn't show much interest in me from the beginning to the end. It was all my wishful thinking. It's not your fault." It wasn't her fault that she didn't like him. As if. Xia Hanyang's eyes were bloodshot. She was the one who provoked him. Her not liking him was the biggest betrayal to him. Xia Hanyang could never forgive her. He couldn't let go of her. Xia Hanyang's hand was still slamming the door, creating great pressure for her. His voice was extremely gentle. "So what are you afraid of? Are you afraid that I'll rape you?" Wei Wei Bai, damn, you're self-aware. //T. Chapter 1937. She had misjudged Xia Hanyang's dark and morbid state. After he finished, he couldn't help but laugh. "I won't do this kind of thing. After all, we have signed a contract, so no matter what I do to you, both of us are in love. It's okay even if you resist, it's all fun." What a beast. He was worse than a beast. Using such a gentle tone to talk about such a terrible thing. Xia Hanyang was just short of holding a knife to become a serial killer. Wei Wei Bai frowned and could only reach out to pinch her inner thigh. She was in so much pain that tears came out and her voice choked. Xia Hanyang felt that it was about time. He was just about to get the key to open the door. Suddenly, there was an almost inaudible sobbing sound coming from inside the door. His body stiffened. His unbridled thoughts of harming her were actually suppressed by her faintly discernible cries for a moment. Xia Hanyang bit his lips and looked at the door with red eyes. She was finally afraid and in pain. She could finally feel the despair he had felt all these years. Xia Hanyang thought vengefully, feeling both happy and sad. She didn't know how long she cried, and Xia Hanyang didn't know how long he stood there. Until the system's voice came, "I was blocked just now, what happened to you?" Wei Wei Bai looked up. Her eyes were clear and there were traces of tears, but there were no tears. She touched her throat. It was a little hoarse, caused by forcing herself to cry. Xia Hanyang left. She knew when she heard his footsteps leave the door. The system looked, he seemed to be walking out while putting on his coat. His expression, twisted and divided. It was a little scary. Wei Wei Bai calmly got up and poured herself a glass of water. Xia Hanyang's psychological trauma is too great. The next battle may be tough. Twisted and perverted to that extent. His current state of mind was probably to take revenge on her. Let her experience the despair of being abused. The system frowned, he tried to commit suicide. The information was sometimes updated. It wasn't very detailed in the beginning. The suicide information was just updated. Wei Wei Bai, didn't you say that he went on a hunger strike? The system said, no, it was the 4th year after you left. He was desperate to find you, so he drank and drove off the cliff into the sea. Wei Wei Bai held the cup and was speechless for a moment. She kept a copy of the surveillance video to prevent Xia Hanyang from committing suicide. She also vaguely knew that 100 favorable impression points might be hard to forget for a stubborn person. But it was really unexpected that Xia Hanyang would be so extreme. The system continued, fortunately, there were no reefs where he fell, and the cliff was very low. It was low tide time, and there were fishing boats nearby, so he was saved. The male lead's luck was heaven-defying. Most disasters wouldn't kill them. However, Xia Hanyang, who had died once, had completely turned evil. Wei Wei Bai was silent for a while before she nodded. I got it. Do you have any information about me in prison? The system flipped through it. Yes, because it was made up by the main system, there weren't many twists and turns. It was very plain, and there weren't any accidents. But you can fill in the information yourself. As long as it doesn't exceed the main system's scope, you can add in some plots. Wei Wei Bai said, put in a few bullying cases, and add in some injuries and illnesses. She didn't think that it would make much of a difference whether or not she told him about prison. But Xia Hanyang was so evil. She could only try her best to make use of the sensational past she had. Then she could find the right time to make him waver. The https://www.sashu.com/ the full text at https://www.sashu.com/ download text at https://www.sashu.com they at https://sashu.com// the Chapter 1938. It was useless to convince Xia Hanyang that she loved him. He had to believe it himself. The system said, yes, but the bullying case won't be big, and your injuries won't be too serious. Because serious injuries would leave traces on the body, but Wei Wei Bai's body had no external injuries. Even that long hair was a flaw. After all, no one went to prison without cutting their hair. Sometimes, the system had loopholes. Of course, these loopholes were very small, so everyone ignored them. Wei Wei Bai nodded and then discussed with the system to fill in the details of prison life before she went to change her clothes. It was already late at night. Wei Wei Bai went to sleep peacefully. Xia Hanyang would probably not come back until tomorrow. But she overestimated her physical condition. Her weak body had a high fever in the middle of the night because of the torment. The system sensed her physical condition. Wei Wei Bai opened her eyes. Her face was red, but her eyes were frighteningly bright. I'm fine. If it's not a high fever of more than 40 degrees, it's life-threatening. Don't worry about me. Fever was not a big deal to her. In so many planes, she had been on the brink of death many times. She could face it freely and make use of it. The system wanted to persuade her, but when it saw her determined expression, it fell silent. Xia Hanyang drank with a few of his childhood friends. In the private room, there was a group of men dancing wildly. No woman dared to go near him. No one dared to touch him. Xia Hanyang had kicked a hostess and sent her to the hospital for gastric bleeding. This was not the first time. Everyone was scared. One of the followers, Chen Qing, came over and said, Brother Xia, what happened to the company? Why do you look so sad? Do you need my family's help? Another one, Li Dayan, rushed over and kicked Chen Qing away. Who do you think you are? If something really happened to Brother Xiao's company, what's the use of your family's small company? Then he said with a flattering face, "Brother Xia, is your shoulder hurt from sitting too long in the meeting? Let me rub it for you." The rest of them made a sound of disgust. Xia Hanyang's face was extremely cold. He drank expressionlessly. It was as if he couldn't see what others were doing. However, he drank one cup after another. The brothers at the side were all shocked. Chen Qing suddenly grabbed his hand. What happened? Ever since Xia Hanyang jumped into the sea, he had become much more reserved and calm. There were only a few times when he lost control, like tonight. He felt uneasy. Every time Xia Hanyang was in a bad mood, it was related to that girl. Xia Hanyang was also half drunk. He pushed Chen Qing away and looked coldly at the wine glass. "I'm fine. I'm in a good mood." It was strange that he was in such a good mood. Xia Hanyang couldn't help but laugh. He gritted his teeth and said, "I'm in a damn good mood." Suddenly, he thought of something and slammed the wine cup on the table. Then, he took out his phone and called his personal assistant. In the middle of the night, his assistant immediately picked up the phone. "Tomorrow, pick some books with a strong literary value. Also, instruct someone to buy some medicinal herbs and tonics. I will give you the names of the herbs. These cannot be cut off. You have to supply them for a long time," he instructed in detail and was terrifyingly serious. He even included women's clothes, shoes, and small feminine products. They were mainly comfortable and soft. He also instructed that all the things should not be small and sharp. Chen Qing couldn't help but elbow Lin Chui next to him. "Hey, what's wrong with the boss? Do you plan to enter the medicinal herbs industry or the feminine products industry?" /T. Chapter 1939. Lin Chui rolled her eyes at him. "How would I know? It sounds like living with a woman." Chen Qing and his friends were dumbfounded. Living together. After that, Xia Hanyang continued drinking. They pushed and shoved, and finally, Li Dayan was pushed out as a scapegoat. "Brother Xia, are you in love?" Xia Hanyang paused, looked up lazily, and then said coldly, "Yes, I've been in love for 7 years. Don't you know?" They met and spent nearly a year together. Then she disappeared for 6 years. 7 years was just right. After that, he glanced at the time and suddenly felt that it was very boring. He picked up his coat. "I'm leaving." Chen Qing immediately got up. "I'll be the driver." He restrained himself and didn't drink too much. He didn't trust Xia Hanyang to drive in this state. 2 years ago, they were scared to death when he fell into the sea. Xia Hanyang didn't say anything and walked out calmly. The room fell into a dead silence. Lin Chui suddenly said, "Don't tell me you found Wei Wei Bai." His words stirred up the 1,000-layer stone, and everyone exploded. "Finally, we found her. Will we have a good life in the future?" "Thank God. Congratulations to Brother Xia for getting rid of the fate of being alone. I think Brother Xia will strangle Wei Wei Bai to death." Everyone was silent. What she said was very reasonable, and they had nothing to say. Xia Hanyang sat in the passenger seat with his eyes closed. His face was still dignified and cold, and his frown made people know that he was very uncomfortable. Chen Qing couldn't help but ask, "Did you really find her?" Xia Hanyang opened his eyes. Under the flashing streetlights, his eyes were clear and dark. "Yes, I found her. I went to the place where she used to be and found her trace." Chen Qing knew Xia Hanyang's obsession. At that time, several of them followed him, but they watched as he went crazy for Bai Weiwei step by step. After Wei Wei Bai disappeared, Xia Hanyang was desperate and crazy. Just thinking about it made the few of them fall into despair. At that time, they were worried about leaving Xia Hanyang alone. Chen Qing still remembered the desperate look on Xia Hanyang's face when he tried to find Wei Wei Bai again and again, but to no avail. If he hadn't happened to be there and rushed over to grab the knife, Xia Hanyang would have been finished. Over the past 6 years, Xia Hanyang's tendency to self-destruct had become more and more serious, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Even old Master Xia was filled with regret. If he knew that he would be like this after losing Wei Wei Bai, he shouldn't have let Wei Wei Bai leave. So what if Wei Wei Bai doesn't like Xia Hanyang? It was enough for Xia Hanyang to survive. Chen Qing held the steering wheel nervously. Then, what do you plan to do? Xia Hanyang's love and hatred for Wei Wei Bai were extremely terrible. The psychiatrist couldn't do anything about Xia Hanyang. They could only pray that Xia Hanyang would get over it himself. Xia Hanyang looked at his fingers indifferently, as if he was imagining the temperature of Wei Wei Bai's hair. What can I do? I'll lock her up until I die. Even if I go to hell, I'll take her with me. Although Chen Qing had some guesses in his heart, when Xia Hanyang really said it, he gasped. Brother Xia, this is a crime. They were young and frivolous and did a lot of marginal things. But now that they had entered their own families and become heirs, they matured a lot. They wouldn't touch many things in the past. A faint smile appeared on Xia Hanyang's calm face. A crime. She's an orphan. She has no parents and no relatives. I don't know where she has been these years, but it seems that she hasn't established her own social network. No one will notice if such a person disappears. /download. Chapter 1940. Chen Qing felt cold in his heart. He was not worried that Xia Hanyang would be caught if Wei Wei Bai was locked up. He was worried that Xia Hanyang would become more and more extreme and eventually reach an irreversible desperate situation. In Xia Hanyang's current state, it was not impossible for him to die with Wei Wei Bai. Wei Wei Bai didn't like Xia Hanyang at that time. Everyone knew that. After all, Wei Wei Bai's performance was so good that no one could deny that she liked Xia Hanyang. They couldn't say anything about Xia Hanyang's passion. Now, 6 years later, Wei Wei Bai had no feelings for Xia Hanyang. Chen Qing couldn't help persuading him, Brother Xia, let go of the past. Now that she is back, you can treat her well. Xia Hanyang's eyes were extremely cold. I've done it before. No one can be as good as a bootlicker, but she still doesn't like me. So, if I treat her well, she will only ask for more. She won't like me at all. Xia Hanyang said calmly, my current family background and ability are enough to deal with any accident involving her. Don't worry. Chen Qing thought, that's what I'm worried about. He wanted to say something but stopped. In the end, he remained silent. Xia Hanyang got out of the car smelling of alcohol. He staggered a few steps before he could stand firm. Let's go back. After that, Xia Hanyang ignored him and couldn't wait to go home. He opened the door and the light turned on automatically. The room was full of light. Xia Hanyang looked at the books thrown casually on the sofa, the flowers on the table, and some peeled candy wrappers. The deathly stillness of his room had vanished shortly after her arrival. Xia Hanyang walked to the door, which was still tightly locked. Was she asleep? He glanced at the time. It was 3:00 in the morning. Xia Hanyang was drunk and even a little confused, but he didn't have the impulse to revenge. He took the key and unlocked the door, only to find that it was blocking the table. Was she so afraid of him? Xia Hanyang pursed his lips and narrowed his eyes unhappily. He pushed the corner of the table with one hand and then walked into the room. Without making a sound, he pushed the table away with one hand. Under the dim yellow light of the small table lamp, a petite figure was lying on the bed. Xia Hanyang walked softly to the bed and wanted to kiss her. He even slowed down his breathing for fear of scaring her. He lifted a corner of the quilt. Xia Hanyang looked at her flushed face. It was no longer as pale as it usually was. The bright red color of her face was gorgeous and attractive. His slow mind was a little strange. He couldn't help but reach out to touch her face. The burning temperature shocked him. Wei Wei. He sobered up halfway and immediately reached out to shake her. Bai Weiwei gently opened her eyes, which were extremely moist. Now, she had a bit more vitality, and in the darkness, there was a beauty that was not usually there. He didn't know how long it. Xia Hanyang was when he saw Bai Weiwei didn't know what she saw, but she showed a fragile smile. Mom, you came to pick me up. His hands suddenly trembled, and he could only stare blankly at her smile. She rarely saw Bai Weiwei smile so purely and softly. Her eyes seemed to be shining with gentle stars, which was completely different from her usual indifference. Weiwei Bai stretched out her weak hand, held his palm, and gently rubbed her hot face in his palm. Mom, I'm so tired. I'm really tired. A fragile teardrop fell into Xia Hanyang's palm. Xia Hanyang was at a loss for what to do with the warm and quickly cooling liquid. He looked at her blankly for a while. Then, he couldn't help but soften his gloomy eyes. He almost sighed and said, "What should I do with you?" In the dark night, he looked at her so fragile under the influence of alcohol and let his gentleness wanton. Chapter 1941. Weiwei Bai opened her eyes in a daze, as if she couldn't recognize him. Xia Hanyang couldn't help but say, "Weiwei, you have a fever." Weiwei Bai shook her head gently. "It's okay. I'll be fine. Be fine. Just a little." Of course, Xia Hanyang wouldn't let her be so patient. He reached across her back and under her knees, wrapped the quilt around her, and carried her away. It was the fastest way to go to the hospital with such a fever. Weiwei Bai was a little confused. She was confused by the fever. She rubbed her face against Xia Hanyang's chest and suddenly couldn't help complaining to herself, so hard. Xia Hanyang's body stiffened for a moment. His muscles couldn't be soft. He pursed his lips, didn't do anything excessive, and quickly walked out. Weiwei Bai was so tired that she slowly closed her eyes. She seemed to be talking to herself, and her voice was very hoarse. "Mom, I met a boy. He was very good to me." Xia Hanyang's brain was pierced by something sharp, and his voice became cold. "Who? Which boy?" In the past 6 years, did Weiwei Bai really like an adulterer? Weiwei Bai said in a daze, "A boy who doesn't like to study." Xia Hanyang paused, and then ran faster to the elevator. Was she talking about him? His heart was beating fast, and he couldn't help but ask, "Do you hate him?" Weiwei Bai was silent for a moment, as if it was very difficult to ask this question. Finally, she sighed and said, "Yes, I hate him." This answer was not unexpected. Xia Hanyang's scarred heart didn't even have any fluctuations of pain. When he went downstairs, he saw that Chen Qing was still there. He was smoking with a troubled look, and when he saw Xia Hanyang, he was so shocked that he almost ate the cigarette. Then he saw Xia Hanyang holding a person in his arms. Finally, love turned to hate, and he strangled her to death. Was he going to destroy the evidence? Xia Hanyang saw that he was in a daze and kicked him. "Drive to the hospital." Afraid that she would die, Chen Qing quickly ran into the car. Xia Hanyang also carried her into the back seat and closed the door. The car drove out. Xia Hanyang's face was gloomy. Weiwei Bai's face was very red because of her fever. The wind blew in through the window, and he immediately closed it. Suddenly, he heard her mumble, "But he's very handsome." Xia Hanyang held his breath and asked as if he was afraid of waking her up, "How beautiful?" Wei Wei Bai didn't answer. He lowered his head and found that she was confused by the fever and couldn't open her eyes. Xia Hanyang couldn't help hugging her tightly, feeling a little sad. But she said that he was good-looking. At least in her eyes, there was something about him that attracted her. Even if it was in terms of appearance. This time, Wei Wei Bai had a fever. She was busy in the hospital all night before her fever subsided. However, his body was abnormally weak and had been in a deep sleep. Xia Hanyang specially invited the old Chinese doctor. This old Chinese medicine doctor was an expert in the field of healthcare. He was here to help Xia San adjust his body. The old Chinese medicine doctor felt the pulse of the sleeping Wei Wei Bai for a long time and carefully looked at her face. Finally, he sighed and shook his head. After he went out with Xia Hanyang, he said, "We have to change the prescription. She's so weak at such a young age. She'll suffer when she gets older." Xia Hanyang's lips trembled. If she hadn't left 6 years ago, her current body wouldn't have been like this under his care. She couldn't even take care of herself, but she dared to leave him. Xia Hanyang walked into the ward with a deep and tired face. He found that after the fever subsided, Wei Wei Bai woke up with a pale face. She seemed to be a little confused and looked at the hospital. Then she slowly looked at him. The download address is at https://www.sashu.com. Chapter 1942. Xia Hanyang stood at the door for a long time before slowly walking into the ward. He didn't care about anything. After walking over, he held her head and kissed her hair. After reuniting, he was very presumptuous and strong to her. He liked her and loved her. That had never changed. It was normal to love someone and want to be close to them. He didn't pretend to be a hypocrite. He gave up his benefits because she didn't want to. Wei Wei Bai was stunned. She moved her lips but didn't protest in the end. Xia Hanyang poured water for her and stared at her drinking it. Maybe his eyes were so focused that Wei Wei Bai seemed to be a little unaccustomed to it. She frowned and said, "What's wrong with me?" Xia Hanyang stared at her unhealthy face for a long time before sitting down on the chair beside the bed. "You have a fever. The highest temperature is about 40 degrees. Wei Wei Bai was still calm and didn't think that a high fever was a big deal. She said politely, "Thank you for sending me to the hospital." Xia Hanyang's face was still taut. His eyes were filled with dark and surging emotions. Then he rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Back then, did you really not like me at all?" He finally asked in a hoarse voice and tried his best to keep calm. When he asked this question, he didn't even dare to look at Wei Wei Bai. Wei Wei Bai held the glass of water. Hearing this question, she seemed to be a little surprised. She looked at him in a trance for a moment. Then she smiled softly. "It's a little long ago. I don't remember it clearly." Xia Hanyang's expression froze for a moment, and then sadness climbed into his eyes. He smiled sarcastically. "That's right. It's natural for you to forget it after so many years." Wei Wei Bai touched the glass unhurriedly, as if she didn't care about Xia Hanyang's attitude. It was such a calm attitude that provoked Xia Hanyang. For a moment, he even had the urge to smash the ward. He hated this expression of hers the most. He was always asking for humiliation in front of her. Wei Wei Bai tilted her head and looked at him with a kind of calm and soft eyes. There was no resentment or fear. She suddenly whispered, "You've grown up." Back then, Xia Hanyang was reckless and insolent, and his adolescent hormones were off the charts. The current him had a sinister look on his face, and his body and temperament were incomparably mature. Xia Hanyang said sarcastically, "It's been a few years. You've been starving yourself into malnutrition. That's why you haven't grown anything." After he finished speaking, his gaze lingered on her chest for a few seconds before he awkwardly looked away. Wei Wei Bai did not care about his attitude. Her face was very pale, so pale that it was unhealthy. Xia Hanyang stared at her face for a while and suppressed his impulse to smash the house. He forcefully pushed this topic away. After so many years of despair, he wanted an answer. "You clearly didn't like me back then, so why did you keep playing the game of boyfriend and girlfriend with me? Don't you think it's childish?" Wei Wei Bai calmly touched the cup with her fingertips. After a moment of silence, she sighed and said, "Aren't you the same as you are now?" Xia Hanyang had grown up a little, but his overbearing and vicious character had never changed. Xia Hanyang was at a loss for a moment, and then he reacted. "Are you saying that back then, it was because I took you by force, just like now, that you had no choice but to be with me?" Wei Wei Bai smiled and softly responded, "At that time, you liked to bully people very much. I couldn't afford to waste my time with you, so I could only comply with you." Xia Hanyang's fingertips were cold, and his face was full of sarcasm with a faint smile. "In your eyes, I'm really a bad person." Download the at https://m, Sashu. COMT. Chapter 1943. He thought she was playing with him at that time. What was worse was that she thought he was going to bully her, so she had no choice but to deal with it. Wei Wei Bai shook her head. "Later, I felt that you weren't really bad, so I wanted you to study hard." The veins on the back of Xia Hanyang's hand were about to pop out. "Enough, study, study. What else can you do besides study? Look at yourself. Can your so-called study make your body better? Or can it let you live a rich life? My current life is not about studying. It's about my foundation that allows me to stand in this position." He had known since he was a child. He was born to stand taller than 90% of people. Even if he was a good-for-nothing, he could live a life of luxury without doing anything. Therefore, studying was not essential to him, and those few test papers were even more useless. He had put in so much effort to study and take the college entrance examination. It wasn't for the score, but to make her happy. Wei Wei Bai's face turned paler. She seemed to have been enduring, and cracks appeared in her calm eyes. Her fingers stroked the quilt, and the tips of her fingers were red and unusually conspicuous. Finally, she lowered her head, and her long hair fell on her cheeks. Her pale face made one's heart palpitate, and her lips had lost the color of healthy people, leaving only a thin layer of pink. Even her clear and calm eyes had lost their color and were incomparably gloomy. She looked so fragile that she could disappear at any time. Xia Hanyang looked at her silently, and his heart ached because of her. He hated her for being so cold, but he also resented her for being so fragile and pitiful. Suddenly, he heard her murmur something in a low voice. He couldn't help but ask, "What did you say?" Wei Wei Bai was silent for a moment, and then she looked up and revealed a sad smile. "I can only study, Xia Hanyang." Xia Hanyang was at a loss for a moment. He had no idea what she was talking about. After a while, he suddenly woke up with a start. He recalled the information that he had investigated when he first met her. She had no parents, and her beastly adoptive father was simply a disaster for her. She was so poor that she had nothing. He had been to the place where she lived, and he couldn't imagine how a person could live in that kind of place. So he knew that she studied hard to get out of her predicament. But Xia Hanyang frowned and couldn't help retorting, "You have me. Even if you don't study and can't go to college, you can rely on me." He brought her home because his heart ached for her. He wanted to protect her. Could it be that she did not feel anything at all? When Wei Wei Bai heard his words, her dim eyes lit up a little, but there was obvious mockery in them. Rely on you? I don't deserve you, Xia Hanyang. Xia Hanyang suddenly clenched his fists and said angrily, who told you that you don't deserve me? Who dares to insult you in front of me? At that time, he had protected her tightly. However, there was no telling which bastard would dare to steal his woman and bully Wei Wei Bai. Wei Wei Bai was also someone who didn't say anything. At that time, he had a rough temper, so she might not even know that she was being bullied. Wei Wei Bai shook her head gently and said calmly, this is the truth. I've never been in the same class as you. I've used up all my strength just to survive. I don't have the time to fall in love, and I don't have the time to like anyone. I don't have the qualifications to be with you. When Xia Hanyang heard this, a chill spread throughout his body. The calmer she was, the more frightened he was. Wei Wei Bai actually said such words of inferiority. In his eyes, she had always been arrogant and calm. Even if she lived in such a terrible place, he didn't see a trace of uncleanness on her. Chapter 1944. In front of her, he felt that he was the one who should feel inferior. Xia Hanyang couldn't help asking, why do you have this idea? Is it because of what my grandfather said? You don't have to listen to what that old man said. Wei Wei Bai couldn't help but smile, but there was no joy. She even looked a little cold. No, this society is so cruel. I'm just mature early. Instead of pinning my hopes on your illusory love, it's better to take the money and leave. In this way, everyone will be happy. In this way, everyone will be happy. Xia Hanyang's voice was almost shrill. Everyone is happy, but I'm not. Wei Wei Bai didn't move at all. She said softly and indifferently. Xia Hanyang, I've never been good. I was poor and had low self-esteem. I relied on studying hard to maintain my fragile self-esteem. I endured humiliation to survive. I knew that Beast had bad intentions towards me, but I still lived in his house. Speaking of this, the indifferent arrogance on her face finally disappeared. Instead, there was a trace of resentment. Because of this cruel expression, her pale face burst into an unimaginable coldness. She said softly, I was afraid of being bullied by you. I would rather pretend to stay with you than resist and leave. I was more greedy for a comfortable and wealthy life, so I took 10 million yuan and left directly. Xia Hanyang said coldly, that's enough. If you really love money, you can be rich by holding on to me. Why did you accept that old man's 10 million yuan? She was not an idiot. Compared with 10 million yuan, even a retard would know that it was expensive. Wei Wei Bai sneered. Because it's easier and more comfortable to take 10 million yuan than to be with you. Xia Hanyang almost ground out his words. Are you done? After all, you don't like me and want to get rid of me to take money. Wei Wei Bai was stunned and stared at him silently. She forced a smile. I can't like you. Xia Hanyang couldn't understand. Why can't you like me? Wei Wei Bai finally couldn't stand it anymore. She smashed the cup on the ground and looked at Xia Hanyang with red eyes. Because I'm not worthy. I have nothing. In front of you, other than my self-esteem, which part of me is worthy of you? She gnashed her teeth and said to Xia Hanyang in a fierce voice, I can't afford to lose. I can't put everything I have on a high and mighty man like you, who is rich and has countless ways to retreat. I'm not stupid. If I like you, you'll still be the young master of the Xia family if something goes wrong. What would I be then? Xia Hanyang looked at her blankly. He had never seen her explode like that before. The calmness in her eyes disappeared and was replaced by all kinds of twisted pain. Wei Wei Bai pursed her lips and tilted her head. Her sarcastic words were somewhat vicious. What is like? It's comparable to getting into a good school and getting a good job to keep me alive. It was still comparable to the 2 steamed buns my mother bought when she was half starving when she went to the construction site to earn money. Or does it give me a sense of security compared to the 10 million? Wei Wei Bai said, a person who can't survive is not worthy of liking anyone. If I like you regardless of everything, I can only die if you don't want me. Xia Hanyang stared at her blankly. All kinds of words were stuck in his chest. He didn't dare to say a word. He had never seen this side of Wei Wei Bai. She was realistic, indifferent, and heartbreaking. Tearing apart her cold and arrogant appearance, he saw that she was actually cold and calculative. She was calculative even when she liked him, for fear that she would lose money if she liked him. You can see it when you open the bookshelf next time. If you like. Chapter 1945. Tearing apart her cold and arrogant appearance, her various calculations were unexpectedly cold to this extent. She was so calculative even when she liked him, as if she was afraid that liking him would result in a loss. Xia Hanyang finally couldn't help but say, "Are you so sure that I will abandon you?" He couldn't refute her words. Because he did have countless ways to retreat. But she didn't. Wei Wei Bai looked at him coldly, "I'm not sure, but my life doesn't allow me to do uncertain things, so I can only abandon the possibility of liking and falling in love with you." After saying that, Wei Wei Bai seemed to collapse. She looked away and said indifferently, "You see, I've never been the beautiful person in your memory. I have all kinds of shortcomings, and I'm stingy and calculative. I won't abandon the bread of life for so-called liking and love. How many days can you like me like this? Let's go, Xia Hanyang." After saying that, she didn't look at him and said in a weak voice, "I'm very tired, don't make me more tired." Xia Hanyang sat beside her in a daze, his mind a mess. Seeing her pale face and cold sweat on her forehead, he knew that she was really tired. Xia Hanyang suddenly got up and turned to leave. He saw Wei Wei Bai's lips suddenly curl into a self-deprecating smile from the corner of his eyes. It was as if she was mocking him. She was right. Once she revealed her character full of shortcomings. His attitude towards her changed drastically. After Xia Hanyang left, the system dared to speak. "Don't you want to be a cold and aloof little fairy? You want to be a vicious supporting female character who lacked love in childhood?" Wei Wei Bai frowned. "I can't help it. Otherwise, I couldn't find a reason to dislike Xia Hanyang, so I had no choice but to sully myself." The biggest knot in Xia Hanyang's heart. She didn't like him. So as long as she could solve the knot in his heart, the rest was not a big problem. So she didn't dare to like others because of her personality flaw. It wasn't because Xia Hanyang was too bad that she didn't like him. Thinking of this, Xia Hanyang's heart knot was untied. The system said, "If you do this, aren't you afraid that the male lead's feelings for you will turn cold?" What the fuck? His personality had changed from an arrogant straight-A student to an inferiority complex and vengeful one. This contrast was so big that it made people's faces twitch. Wei Wei Bai snorted, "The mission has been completed. Xia Hanyang's favorability has dropped to 0. That's right, it actually forgot that the mission was completed. Therefore, the host intends to let loose. Was she back to being a little princess again? The system suddenly said, "The male lead has returned." Without any hesitation, Wei Wei Bai immediately reached out and rubbed her eyes. Then, she crossed her hands on her knees and buried her head in her hands, pursing her lips tightly. The sound of choking sobs could be heard again and again, as if it was scratching the heart and liver of the people. System, this ability to cry just like that. Xia Hanyang's footsteps paused for a long time. Only then did he regain his speed and walk to the bedside. He saw that she was almost curled up, as if this position could give her a sense of security. She buried her head in her knees, trembling all over as she tried to suppress her cries. She didn't even know that he had returned. Xia Hanyang reached out his trembling hand, as if he wanted to touch her head to stop her from crying. However, a burst of anger made him impulsive. He suddenly put his hand on her shoulder and pressed her down on the bed. Wei Weibai was caught off guard, revealing her tear-filled face. She looked at him awkwardly and couldn't react for a while. Xia Hanyang's eyebrows were still gloomy and ruthless, but the expression in his eyes was complex and twisted. He suddenly said in a low voice, "I don't know how long I can like you." Wei Weibai looked at him blankly with tear-filled eyes. She struggled to wipe her tears, not wanting him to see such a vulnerable side of her. However, Xia Hanyang pressed her hand firmly. He touched her tears with his fingers and wiped them away bit by bit. He was gentle but very strong, even a little morbid. "I only know that from the moment I met you until now, my feelings for you have never changed." After he finished speaking, he laughed at himself. "Wei Weibai, I still like you. Maybe I can like you for a lifetime. Believe it or not." Wei Weibai's lips trembled, as if she wanted to say something. However, Xia Hanyang bent down. His breath blew on the tip of her ear, as if he wanted to integrate her into his body and hold her. "By the way, I also have many shortcomings. Aren't we a good match? Do you think you can make me let you go by saying a few more trivial shortcomings?" His voice turned cold. "You look down on me too much. I can bury your dead body for you. What right do you have to say that you don't deserve to like me? You're a scumbag and I'm cheap. You're more than enough for me. Are you thinking about when I won't like you anymore? Wait slowly. Anyway, before I stop liking you, I'll lock you up. No one can escape." That was why he was such a terrible person. How could she say that she wasn't qualified to like him? Xia Hanyang finally couldn't help kissing her forehead. He was incredibly gentle. Ding, the male lead's favorability is at 96, // button. Chapter 1946. Xia Hanyang, in a suit, followed by his assistant and secretary, went to old Master Xiao's birthday party. Not many people came to the birthday party. They were all acquaintances, close friends, and people who had important business dealings with the Xia family. Xia Hanyang saw Xia San, put the gift on the table casually, and said casually, "I see that you are as strong as an ox. I guess you can live for another 50 or 60 years. Old Master Xia was in his 70s. He would be an old monster in another 50 or 60 years. He knew that Xia Hanyang had always talked like this. Xia San didn't say anything. Instead, he tapped the table with his fingers and said, "It's good enough that you don't have to stand at the door to welcome the guests. Why do you feel so uncomfortable to come to my party?" Xia Hanyang's expression was not good. His eyes were as dark as a ghost fire. Xia Hanyang's current state was that strangers should stay away and acquaintances should stay away. Xia Hanyang was expressionless. He took a glass of champagne from the waiter's plate and drank it up. "I salute you for having a long life." This was a show of respect, but it was extremely polite. Xia San didn't ask him not to drive him away like this. He hesitated for a moment and said, "Why don't you bring her to see the guests?" Everyone in Xia Hanyang's circle knew that Wei Weibai had been found. Xia San certainly knew. Everyone heaved a sigh of relief when they finally found the girl. Compared to whether Wei Weibai liked her or not, Xia Hanyang didn't care. After all, Xia Hanyang, who had lost Wei Weibai, was so desperate that he couldn't live. They were scared out of their wits. Therefore, Xia San had no objection to the existence of Wei Wei Bai. It was fine as long as Xia Hanyang could live like a human being. Xia Hanyang's face was gloomy, but his tone softened. She's still sick, and, he hesitated for a moment and said slowly, now she's weak. I'm worried about her. After all, he was afraid that she would run away. Xia San said, treat her gently. She can't be locked up like this. Xia Hanyang said expressionlessly, this is the only way to keep her from leaving. He couldn't take the risk of her leaving. Xia San, he didn't even know how to persuade him. Xia San hesitated again and again. He wanted to say something, but in the end, he remembered that he hadn't gotten the information yet, so he didn't say anything. Xia Hanyang glanced at the time and said, well, I'm leaving. Xia San, it's my birthday, and you're leaving after 5 minutes. Xia Hanyang said, I have a family now. How are you going to have a great-grandchild if I keep accompanying you, old man? Xia San's face twitched. You. I mean, the other party was willing. It was one thing to be imprisoned. If he were to force it, his grandson would be too lowly. Xia Hanyang smiled. Of course, she's very willing. Xia San, no persuasive ability at all. His grandson is jumping back and forth on the edge of committing a crime. His heart is so tired. Xia Hanyang turned around and left. Xia Three rubbed his face tiredly and said to the people beside him, let's speed up the investigation. No matter how he investigated back then, he couldn't find any information on Wei Wei Bai. Moreover, there was one thing that old Master Xia couldn't understand. Why hadn't the 10 million yuan been fulfilled back then? She found Wei Wei Bai to untie the knot in Xia Hanyang's heart. She had to find out why Wei Wei Bai left. Wei Wei Bai had been discharged from the hospital for 3 days. Xia Hanyang left the nanny by her side to take care of her. Most of the time, he returned home early and squatted by the stairs in front of the door to smoke, not daring to go in. // Chapter 1947. His mind was in a mess these days. He remembered that when Wei Wei Bai was with him 6 or 7 years ago, she was calm and indifferent. It seemed that nothing could move her. Sometimes, he didn't dare to give her expensive gifts because he was worried that she wouldn't like them. He could only put in a lot of effort into her food and clothes. Wei Wei Bai definitely didn't know that the clothes she wore back then were handmade inch by a professional tailor using the most comfortable materials. He didn't expect her to find out. After all, at that time, he just wanted her to live a good life. He didn't want to take credit at all. Ordinary people couldn't buy the medicine and supplements that she used to nourish her body. He spent too much effort on it and got used to it. Xia Hanyang had a reason to say that he was cheap. Everyone would be moved by the effort he put in for her. But only she couldn't feel it. She didn't believe that he would always like her. Her outburst in the hospital that day pierced straight into his heart and made his bones hurt. He was stunned by her sudden anger. But after thinking about it carefully these days, he could roughly understand her feelings of not liking him. If he had nothing and someone suddenly loved him and wanted to give him support, he wouldn't want to at all. Because other people's love and support were fragile and not worth mentioning to Xia Hanyang. His life was in his own hands. Maybe Wei Wei Bai was like him, selfish and wanted to control her own life. Thinking of this, Xia Hanyang lit a cigarette and stared at it blankly. There was a trace of despair in his eyes amid the dense smoke. Did that mean that she would never like him? Because she was now trapped by him and had nothing and was forced to rely on him. No one would like this kind of love. Xia Hanyang sneered at himself. But he didn't know what to do except to give her this kind of love. Just imagine letting her leave freely to pursue her own life. He felt cold all over. He was so scared that he couldn't control himself. 6 years ago, he let her go wherever she wanted. Now he didn't dare. Every time she went out, she might disappear. He lost her once and hurt himself in despair for 6 years. He had already gone crazy. He could only let her have a child and give them an extremely strong bond so that it would not be so easy for her to escape. Xia Hanyang regained his coldness and ruthlessness. He slowly put out the cigarette. Wei Wei Bai said that she was not that beautiful. Wasn't he the same? The current him was so sick that even he was afraid of himself. Xia Hanyang got up and opened the door. The nanny was bending over to pour the medicine for Wei Wei Bai. When she saw Xia Hanyang, she immediately nodded and said politely, "Young master." Xia Hanyang waved his hand and let the nanny leave. The nanny tacitly turned around to pack up, then quietly opened the door and left. The television was on. It was a landscape documentary. Wei Wei Bai was half lying on the sofa, reading a book quietly and ignoring Xia Hanyang. But Xia Hanyang's heart was at ease. He had lived for 6 years just for this moment. As long as she was around, his passion for life would surge forth. Xia Hanyang kissed her gently, not daring to use too much strength. Wei Wei Bai was stunned for a moment before she turned to look at him. Xia Hanyang loosened his tie and picked up the bowl of medicine. "Get up and drink, or I'll feed you." Wei Wei Bai frowned and took the bowl. Then she lowered her head and drank slowly. Her table manners were always quiet and slow, which was particularly pleasing to the eye. The so-called inferiority and selfishness in her mouth were not visible at all. //T Chapter 1948. Xia Hanyang sat aside and took off his coat. He was tall and looked good in everything. But she didn't look at him. She said he was good-looking. Xia Hanyang saw that she was gently sucking on the spoon. The light color of the medicinal soup made her lips moist a little more. His eyes widened at once. Maybe he was worse than a beast. Their relationship was broken, but he was still thinking about dirty things when he saw her. Xia Hanyang went to get the frozen mineral water and drank several mouthfuls to calm himself down. He used to look for her, but he didn't have the energy to think about it. Now that she was back, Xia Hanyang was such a mature man. He would become a woman if he didn't act on impulse. Moreover, he was very bad now and harbored evil intentions. He wanted to keep her for a lifetime. Anyway, their relationship was broken. It didn't matter if it was broken a little more. Xia Hanyang stood by the refrigerator and looked at Wei Wei Bai with deep eyes. Wei Wei Bai seemed to feel something. She drank the soup faster and then got up to take the bowl to the kitchen. Xia Hanyang immediately came and took her bowl away, not letting her touch the yang chen shui. He came out of the kitchen, only to see that the door of the room was closed tightly. There was no one in the living room. Xia Hanyang couldn't help rubbing his face. His face was covered with wolf hair. Otherwise, how could she see his dirty thoughts? He was not in a hurry. He took a bottle of beer and drank some wine in this situation. He was too embarrassed to be so shameless. Xia Hanyang walked to the door, sat down, and drank the beer unhurriedly. Then he raised his voice and said, "Wei Wei, it's still early. Are you going to bed?" Wei Wei Bai was sullen and didn't speak. Xia Hanyang said, "Do you want to come out and have a drink? I'll drink wine and you can have some juice." Wei Wei Bai finally answered, "No, I want to sleep." Xia Hanyang shook the beer can and said with a dangerous look in his eyes, "Today, I attended Old Master's birthday party. Old Master's body can't take it anymore. He's going to die in the ICU. Before he dies, he's waiting for his grandson. But I have feelings for you. What do you think? The system rebutted, his grandfather has no problem living for 20 to 30 years, don't listen to his nonsense. Bai Weiwei was full of admiration for his shamelessness. She was silent for a while before saying, I'm infertile. Xia Hanyang almost spat out the wine in his mouth. How could he retaliate like that? But who was he? He was a shameless man. He finished the beer in one gulp and threw the can into the trash can. He stood up and said, it's okay. I specialize in treating this. I'll treat you. Weiwei Bai immediately pushed the table, wanting to block the door and prevent the big bad wolf from entering. Unfortunately, the big wild wolf was very fast, and the table had not been pushed over yet. The door opened. Xia Hanyang smelled faintly of alcohol and his eyes were shining like a wolf's. He looked at Weiwei Bai in a soft dress and smiled. Weiwei Bai's expression changed and she stepped back. He followed her step by step. He seemed to be teasing her, but there was an indescribable seriousness in his actions. Do you like children? Why don't we have a child too? Weiwei Bai avoided him. I don't like it. Don't come over. Xia Hanyang smiled. How can you be sure that you don't like it before? Weiwei Bai retreated to the floor-to-ceiling window. She had nowhere else to go. She grabbed the curtain and hid half of her body behind it. Don't come over, Xia Hanyang. Xia Hanyang saw that she was like a little white rabbit. He could see that her calmness had collapsed and she was panicking. Thou. Chapter 1949. Suddenly, he forgave her for her indifference. She was not really indifferent. As long as he forced himself on her, she would be scared to death. Although she wanted to show her little claws to scratch him, she was still weak. He was too lazy to hide his feelings. He was possessed. He liked everything about her. After 6 years of searching for her, he finally found her. He finally found her. He didn't want to torment himself anymore. He just wanted to be with her. Weiwei, we've been apart for so long. Give me a hug as a gift. He didn't go up to grab her. Instead, he carefully lured her. This house was impenetrable. She couldn't hide anywhere. If he wanted to do whatever he wanted, she had nowhere to run. But Xia Hanyang knew that he couldn't do such a thing. It was not that he had high moral standards, but he didn't forget how her stepfather treated her. He didn't want to be on the same level as that beast in her heart. Weiwei Bai stood behind the curtain. Her fingers were white as she pinched the curtain. She seemed to think that she was doomed. Her face was pure under the light. Her eyes were like a pool of water. Xia Hanyang's fingers stiffened. Her external arrogance was stripped away, revealing her fragile inner self. Only then did he know that she was so fragile. She was like a poor little girl who had been curled up pitifully in her heart. And he forced her to show such a pitiful side. Xia Hanyang also felt that his heart was broken into pieces. He sighed. He couldn't break her, but he also couldn't give her up. When it came to her, he was not a man. He was a woman. He took a few steps back, tried to suppress the evil in his heart, and said with difficulty, "It's late. Go to sleep." He slept in the guest room. He couldn't wait to sleep with her in his arms. He restrained this almost impossible to suppress thought. Xia Hanyang walked out with heavy steps. In fact, he wanted to go back to hold her and hug her. This thought kept rolling. He didn't know when he couldn't suppress it anymore. He really became the kind of lowly person that the old master said. Xia Hanyang's tall and straight figure slumped, looking indescribably bleak. When he walked to the door, he was even slower. He was so pitiful. She didn't know if she would take the bait. She wouldn't get pregnant even if she hugged him. Suddenly, he heard light footsteps behind him. His eyes lit up. He had been tricked. His footsteps stiffened as he waited. Hearing such a sincere request, he wondered if it was time to comfort him with love. After waiting for a few seconds, he could no longer maintain this posture. Xia Hanyang looked back, only to see Wei Wei Bai walking to the bed and reaching out to shake the quilt, as if she was going to sleep. When she saw him looking over, she froze. "You. Aren't you going to sleep?" Xia Hanyang, she did not pity him anymore. Sure enough, a woman who could leave for 6 years was extremely heartless. Xia Hanyang was aggrieved and rushed forward. His eyes were red. He suddenly turned around and rushed back. "Sleep. I'm like a werewolf now. I'm hairy and I want to eat people." He threw Wei Wei Bai onto the bed. Wei Wei Bai was stunned by this pounce. When she was about to struggle, Xia Hanyang had already rolled her up with a quilt. Then she was held in his arms like a mummy, unable to move. Wei Wei Bai poked her head out and shouted angrily, "Xia Hanyang, get off me." Xia Hanyang held the mummy in his arms and legs and even had time to pull a pillow for her. There was only one pillow on the bed. She did not give him a chance at all. Xia Hanyang did not care. He squeezed himself onto the same pillow as Wei Wei Bai. His face pressed into her hair. Bai Weiwei sucked in a breath of pain. Xia Hanyang quickly raised his face and reached out to gently grab her hair. Her hair was very long, like silk. He slowly tidied up her hair, took out a clean black and white checkered handkerchief from his trouser pocket, and tied her long hair. Wei Wei Bai stared at him warily. "If you move again, I can't guarantee your safety." Wei Wei Bai immediately dared not move. Xia Hanyang was also tired. He had been tormented by her these days and his mind was full of her. With Wei Wei Bai around, he was 10 times busier than usual. He had to worry about all kinds of women's toys, clothes, food, and furnishings at home. This kind of worry was very reassuring. Xia Hanyang avoided the uncomfortable places where she breathed. He hugged her and slowly closed his eyes. After a long time, Wei Wei Bai thought that he had fallen asleep. Her body just relaxed. He suddenly said softly, "I miss you, Wei Wei." Wei Wei Bai was silent for a long time. She did not say anything, but her body did not resist his approach anymore. The night was silent. Since the two met, they finally had a gentle and quiet night together. //T. Chapter 1950. It was not difficult for Wei Wei Bai to waste time with Xia Hanyang. Because after he caught her, he didn't do anything to hurt her during the days when he hated her the most. She didn't have to worry that he would suddenly explode and drag her down with him. Therefore, she ate and drank as she pleased. She read books and played games on her phone that couldn't connect to the internet. Her days were simple and easy. For Wei Wei Bai, she was very satisfied with this kind of life where she didn't need a strategy and didn't have to worry about whether she would have food tomorrow. Therefore, although her attitude towards Xia Hanyang was not very good, she didn't provoke him either. After the last time Xia Hanyang stayed in her bed, he always found an opportunity to hug her to sleep. Wei Wei Bai struggled a few times and let Xia Hanyang be like this. After all, she still maintained a deceptive character who didn't like to rely on others. If she suddenly became enthusiastic towards Xia Hanyang would think that she was going to run away. Under the nourishment of this relaxed life, she gained 3 kilograms. But after more than a month, anyone would be tired of it. If she had a date to go back, she could just endure it. The problem was that she was forced to stay in this world for a lifetime. Therefore, after more than a month of idling, she finally thought of doing something to solve the knot in Xia Hanyang's heart. 6 years, plus the obsession of self-harm and suicide. Xia Hanyang could really lock her up for a lifetime. After seeing so many perverts, Wei Bai was not surprised by Xia Hanyang. She even thought that Xia Hanyang was very gentle. She said that he had grown up. She said that he had grown from a little mutt to a big husky. She didn't mean that he had really grown into a wolf. So Wei Bai picked and finally discussed with the system, how about I have depression? The system was a little busy recently because it was too idle, so it took some work to support itself and the host. It was knitting some sweaters, hats, bracelets, or hair ornaments. If he did these things, he would be able to gain 6 to 7 days of HP every month. He was simply too idle, and he was worried about leaving his host, so he could only accept this kind of work. As soon as he heard that his host was going to cause trouble again, he said earnestly, "Can't you just live a good life? Depression, car accidents, leukemia, suicide, and so on. You've been watching too many Korean dramas. You should read more men's web novels. I guarantee that you'll be optimistic and full of enthusiasm." Wei Bai, is it an illusion? The system had been acting like a housewife recently. Wei Bai continued to pick and choose. She felt that other diseases were more troublesome. Or was it a mental patient? It was normal for people to have problems after being locked up for a long time. Moreover, she was familiar with depression. She had suffered from it a few times. Wei Bai, I also want to live a good life, but I can't be locked up forever. If I don't torment Xia Hanyang, I won't even have the fun of shopping online. So be it. Not having Wi-Fi was killing her. She had endured it for more than a month. If she endured it any longer, she would have to climb out of the window and connect to the internet cable next door. So Wei Bai patted her face and said lazily, "Time to work." If she continued to be lazy, she would become useless. Xia Hanyang was really good at raising people. He raised her until her limbs were not working hard. Even if she was lucky enough to escape in the future, she would not be able to support herself. Maybe it was his idea. What a vicious little wolf. Depression was not something that could come easily. She began to slowly reduce the amount of food she ate. She stayed at home every day and did not exercise much. Eating less was not a burden. Crossover system, Prince Charming, come here. Chapter 1951. Xia Hanyang was very sensitive. He found out when she began to lose appetite. But he thought that she had eaten too many tonics and began to resist. After all, there were too many medicinal soups. He was also anxious and hoped that she could recover quickly. The old Chinese medicine doctor's words really scared him. He wouldn't be able to put his heart at ease if he didn't take care of his short-lived foundation. For many days, she ate less and less. Even the nanny couldn't help but tell him. Xia Hanyang became more and more uneasy. He went home early before dinner. As soon as he entered the door, he saw the nanny cleaning the table. She didn't eat much. Wei Bai looked weak. She looked at the table blankly, with tiredness in her calmness. Her appearance shocked him. He had been so happy these days that she sometimes didn't pay much attention when she was in a trance. Years of accumulated uneasiness and pain were soothed because of her return. As a result, Xia Hanyang didn't think about what his happiness meant to Wei Bai. "Little master, you're back." The nanny immediately shouted when she saw him come back. Wei Bai's eyes returned to normal and she looked at him indifferently. The tiredness just now was gone. It seemed to be an illusion. Xia Hanyang felt uneasy. But he suppressed it and said, "I didn't eat." "Set the table again." The nanny immediately nodded and went to the kitchen to set the table again. Wei Wei Bai had got up and was about to leave the table. However, Xia Hanyang walked over and pressed her down again. He said with a cold face, "Eat with me." Wei Wei Bai said, "I'm full." Xia Hanyang's face darkened. He said stubbornly, "Eat with me more." His tone brooked no refusal. Wei Wei Bai didn't resist but sat down obediently. Then she said listlessly, "Okay." This attitude was very abnormal. Wei Wei Bai was very cold and arrogant. She was angry because she was locked up by him, so she didn't like him. Sometimes she couldn't resist what he said and would despise him with her eyes. But just now, she didn't. Her eyes were like a wasteland, and he couldn't see any emotion. The uneasiness in Xia Hanyang's heart became more intense. The dishes were served again. There were 2 new dishes and a soup. Together with the dishes that Wei Wei Bai had never eaten before, it looked exceptionally delicious. However, Wei Wei Bai couldn't be bothered to look at it. As long as one was alive, one would have an appetite. If one had an appetite, one would be obsessed with good food. The nanny was able to serve his parents and him for so many years. Other things aside, her culinary skills were outstanding. She hadn't eaten much for several days. A normal person would definitely be hungry and wouldn't turn a blind eye to a table full of dishes. At first, he thought that she was threatening his freedom by not eating. However, she had no such intention at all. It was as if she had no interest in food at all. Xia Hanyang picked up his chopsticks and put some of her favorite dishes into her bowl. "Eat some more, Wei Wei." Wei Wei Bai lazily looked up at him. The tiredness in her eyes was light, but it was impossible to ignore. She slowly picked up her chopsticks and ate the food. There was no sign of resistance. Xia Hanyang heaved a sigh of relief. As long as she was willing to eat, it was fine. He wasn't stupid. He had locked her up for almost 2 months and barely allowed her to go out. The insecurity in his heart made him morbidly want her to stay in the house, so that she wouldn't disappear. However, a normal person would have problems sooner or later if they were locked up like this. // Chapter 1952. Xia Hanyang didn't eat much himself, but he tried his best to pick up food for her. He estimated her appetite and planned to feed her. But before he could pick up half of her food, Wei Wei Bai's face changed. She threw down her chopsticks and rushed into the bathroom. Xia Hanyang panicked and hurried to follow her. After Wei Wei Bai vomited all the food, Xia Hanyang rushed over and wanted to pat her back. But she frowned, pushed his hand away, and then went to rinse her mouth and wash her face. Seeing her like this, Xia Hanyang's uneasiness turned into a sharp blade, cutting his heart. He hurriedly asked, "What's wrong?" Wei Wei Bai turned back and said calmly, "Nothing. I just don't want to eat. I ate too much and want to vomit." Xia Hanyang was not so easy to fool. While Wei Wei Bai was still in a daze, he picked her up and walked out. "Go to the hospital." Wei Wei Bai suddenly frowned in disgust. "I don't want to go." Xia Hanyang was frightened by her state. She was so strong that it was terrible. "It's not up to you." Wei Wei Bai grabbed his clothes and gasped, "Xia Hanyang, do you know that you are really sick? You locked me up for so long and took me to the hospital as soon as you went out." "I'm fine." Xia Hanyang had already gotten in the car. He pressed her to the passenger seat and fastened her seatbelt. He sneered, "You're fine. You eat until you vomit. The doctor has the final say." Wei Wei Bai resisted for a while, but was finally dragged to the hospital by Xia Hanyang for a physical examination. The final result was that there was nothing wrong with her. It was just that her stomach was weak and she had indigestion. Xia Hanyang asked the doctor closely. The doctor answered carefully, maybe it's because of her mood and lack of exercise. Lack of exercise was a problem. Mood, Xia Hanyang looked back at Wei Wei Bai, who was sitting in the chair. She looked at the nurses who came and went with a blank expression. Her expression was distant and calm. She seemed to be isolated from the people around her, as if she was sitting in another world. She had no appetite and rarely exercised. Recently, she had also been sleepy. Moreover, she didn't seem to be interested in anything. According to the nanny, she hadn't been reading or playing games recently. He liked to be in a daze. He thought that locking her up for a few years would cause her to develop mental problems. At that time, they had already been together for a few years. She definitely couldn't run away. After all, a few years was enough for him to raise her until she didn't know anything about the world and had no ability to survive. She was not even allowed to interact with the internet in such an era of information technology. A few years later, she didn't even know how to get a ride when she went out. At that time, he would be able to take her out of the house without worry. He did not deny that his thoughts were indeed vicious. But he didn't want to live another 6 years without her. Xia Hanyang walked up to her with a heavy heart. However, he saw her staring blankly at the wall not far away as if she didn't see him. This was not normal. Xia Hanyang couldn't help asking, "What are you looking at, Wei Wei?" Wei Wei Bai suddenly woke up and looked up at him. Her eyes were still blank. Nothing. Then she stood up. "Are you done? Can we go back now?" Xia Hanyang looked at her blankly for a while and suddenly said, "I'll go to the bathroom and come back later." Wei Wei Bai nodded indifferently. Xia Hanyang slowly moved away. When he reached the door, he paused for a moment and then walked out. He didn't go anywhere. And he was leaning against the wall. If it was the Wei Wei Bai of the past, she would definitely run away. There was no one guarding her. However, he waited for a full 10 minutes and still didn't see her run away. Crossover system, my idol, come here. Crossover system, my idol, come here. / crossover system, my idol, come here. Crossover system, my idol, come here. Button, crossover system, my idol, come here. Chapter 1953. Xia Hanyang walked back with heavy steps and saw that Wei Wei Bai was still sitting in the chair. Her posture and expression had not changed. She had not run away and had been waiting for him. Xia Hanyang had been forced to see a psychiatrist so many times that he was very familiar with this place. Then it was his turn to force Wei Wei Bai to see a psychiatrist. The results were not surprising. Mild depression had already shown signs of metastasizing to moderate depression. At first, she was just not interested in anything and liked to sleep and not eat. In the future, when her depression was serious, she would have the impulse to commit suicide. Xia Hanyang was familiar with this and knew what was going on with Wei Wei Bai without even looking at it. Did she really hate him so much? He had only locked her up for 2 months and she was already depressed. He took the test results and walked out of the door blankly, only to see Wei Wei Bai sitting quietly. Her thin shadow was elongated on the ground, and her side face was pale and bloodless. After such a long time, she did not look healthy at all. Xia Hanyang was in a mess, but he calmed down at this moment. He was unwilling to let go of her. But locking her up like this would cause her to commit suicide slowly. The doctor also said that her current character was caused by the huge trauma in her childhood. Her parents died and she lived in poverty. She had never had a day of peace. Her life was full of all kinds of painful and gloomy experiences. She also met him now, who was thinking of ways to control her life and not giving her a chance to escape. How could he not know that this was wrong? But he did not dare to let go. Xia Hanyang came to her with a glimmer of hope. "Let's go home, Wei Wei." Wei Wei Bai did not respond, but she still got up and followed him. She looked as if she did not care about anything. Xia Hanyang's heart was tight and uncomfortable. He reached out and grabbed her arm, looking at her deeply. Suddenly, he asked softly, if I let you go out, will you come back?" She had a knot in her heart, not only because he locked her up. The doctor's words echoed in his mind for a long time. Apart from her childhood, she was so easily depressed because she had not lived well in the past few years. That was why she felt more desperate about life. Where had she been for the past 6 years? For the first time, Xia Hanyang wanted to flip through this document. Wei Wei Bai paused and looked back at him strangely. Suddenly, she sneered, "Xia Hanyang, I think you are very strange. With your current status, you can get any woman you want. Why do you insist on me? What's so good about me? You're so persistent in running around for me, worrying about me. Aren't you afraid that when you think about it in the future, you'll feel that it's not worth it to sacrifice for a woman like me?" Xia Hanyang frowned, knowing that she was emotionally unstable. "This is a common symptom of depression." He said patiently, "I don't think it's not worth it to you. I never will. Wei Wei Bai, there is no such thing as forever. Do you think forever is short? You're just unwilling to give up now. You're young and you can't get it, that's why you're holding on to me so tightly." Xia Hanyang looked at her frighteningly cold eyes. His blood rushed to his head, and he felt that his kindness had been regarded as ill intent. He said in a trembling voice, "I'm unwilling to give up. Would I commit suicide because I'm unwilling to give up? When I jumped into the sea with the car, I didn't want to live anymore. If I was really unwilling to give up, would have killed you the first time I saw you, instead of doting on you like you're my ancestor." Wei Wei Bai was stunned, and a trace of disbelief appeared in her eyes. Suicide. Download the at https://m, Sashu. Com. Chapter 1954. Xia Hanyang stiffened his neck and wanted to slap himself for saying such a shameful thing. He immediately said, "No, it's nonsense. Don't say that you're unwilling or unworthy in the future. I won't listen." After saying that, he still felt ashamed that a man would commit suicide to get his woman back. Even a good-for-nothing wouldn't do that. Xia Hanyang was about to leave angrily. Her hands were like willow branches in spring, gently hugging his waist. Her strength was very light. As long as Xia Hanyang took a step forward, he would break away from this hug. She was so careful that she could let go of him at any time. Xia Hanyang didn't dare to take a step forward. She didn't press her body against his and just hugged his waist lightly. "What's the matter with jumping into the sea?" Her voice was suppressed and a little hesitant. Xia Hanyang really didn't want to talk about the past. He regretted jumping into the sea and not dying. Because if he was disabled, how could he find Wei Wei Bai in the future? If he found her, Wei Wei Bai would probably dislike him. Now, she would even dislike him if he was all right. Xia Hanyang was silent for a while before saying, "At that time, I was in a hurry to find you and accidentally drove into the sea. It was an accident, not a suicide. In fact, he was already desperate. So he thought that it was better to die. It was meaningless to live like this." Of course, he wouldn't say such useless thoughts. Wei Wei Bai seemed to take a deep breath, and her fingertips were trembling badly. Her voice was suppressed and hoarse, as if she said inadvertently, "I thought that after you knew that I didn't like you and left you for 10 million yuan, you would dump me and live your own life." Xia Hanyang's mouth twitched, and he was about to sneer at her. How could he dump her? She was the one who dumped him, huh? No, why did this sound so strange? How could she be sure that after the old man gave her 10 million yuan? How could he know that she took the money and left? At first, he just thought that she was missing and killed. He was so neurotic that he was looking for murderers or kidnappers. It wasn't unreasonable for him to think so. Because they offended a criminal gang. The gang was buried alive. Who knew if there were any accomplices who hadn't been caught? If his grandfather hadn't shown him the surveillance video to save him, he didn't know that she took the money and kicked him away. And that year, there was some secret about the surveillance video in the living room. If Bai Weiwei was really as selfish as she said, would she ignore this detail? Doubts flashed in Xia Hanyang's mind. He suddenly asked softly, back then, did you deliberately put on an act for my grandfather? No, to be precise, it was for him. Bai Weiwei's hand shook. She suddenly released him and immediately retreated, and not Xia Hanyang. Xia Hanyang suddenly turned around, his eyes bursting with unimaginable fierceness. He approached him step by step. You know that there are surveillance cameras. If you really only want money, you wouldn't have suddenly turned against me like this. Aren't you afraid that I'll take revenge on you? To you, too. And then her actions wouldn't work at all. She knew how vengeful he was. Even if she took the money, she wouldn't say such harsh words. She was such a smart person. It would be easy for her to get 10 million yuan from him. How could she be so decisive and trample on his heart? She just left. // Chapter 1955. Weiwei Bai panicked for a moment, but she soon calmed down. She said coldly, you think too much, Xia Hanyang. Don't beautify my behavior. I'm never as beautiful as you think. Her face was terribly pale, and her eyes were trembling. It seemed that this topic made her very uncomfortable. Xia Hanyang wanted to continue to ask, but thinking of her unstable mood, he immediately stopped his impulse. He immediately showed a smile. Beautify. You're wrong. You've always been beautiful in my eyes. Beautify was a self-deceiving word. And her beauty was real. Weiwei Bai was silent for a long time, and finally sighed and said helplessly, don't you think it's irrational? Whether it was the accident of jumping into the sea or looking for me for so many years, one day you will regret doing so much for me. Xia Hanyang sneered. I only know that I've been living a life worse than death for the past 6 years. No matter how much I regret it, it won't be worse than these 6 years. His blood was aroused, and his whole body was furious. His eyes were filled with ruthlessness and madness that burned with reckless abandon. It even had an infatuation that made people tremble. Weiwei Bai was frightened by his eyes and stepped back a few steps. She seemed to be at a loss and felt that he was unreasonable. Xia Hanyang was stung by the subtle panic in her eyes, and he immediately sobered up. He couldn't control himself again when he shouted at a depressed person. 6 years was enough to turn his irritable temperament into a cruel and cold madman. Weiwei Bai suddenly whispered to herself, Xia Hanyang, I'm really not worth your self-abuse. When she spoke, her thick eyelashes shone with fine light. Her beautiful eyes were a lot lighter, as if they were filled with water vapor, making them look moist. She was beautiful and pitiful. Xia Hanyang felt that he was blind before. Why did he always think that she was cold and arrogant and unapproachable? She obviously had a cold and arrogant shell, but in fact, she was very soft. He remembered that when he took her paper for the first time, she looked at him so pitifully. At that time, his heart was hooked. He obviously hated this little pitiful girl. But surprisingly, he didn't reject it that much in his heart. Otherwise, he wouldn't have dragged her onto the cruise. It was as if he wanted to show off his amusement park and broaden her horizons. After thinking about it, wasn't he an idiot? He was obviously seduced by her, but he was still holding on to his pride. Xia Hanyang stared straight at her without blinking. Wei Wei Bai took a few steps back from his stare. Only then did he realize that the green light in his eyes had appeared. He had been very angry recently, and he couldn't find a way to vent it. Wei Wei Bai should be softer and more pitiful. His mind was filled with nonsense. He didn't care how self-deprecating she was. Depression was like that, self-pitying and lamenting. Xia Hanyang didn't care about her resistance. He reached out to hold her face and looked at her carefully. He wished he could put his feelings into her heart. Just by looking at her face, that beautiful feeling was enough to drown him. Her eyes were his cage, locking him in. He wanted nothing more than to cling to the cage and not come out. Xia Hanyang's tone was terrifyingly serious. It was no different from going to the battlefield. Wei Wei Bai, listen to me. It's not up to you to decide whether it's worth it or not. You're not me. Don't make decisions for me. After he finished speaking, he felt that his tone was too harsh. How could it not be harsh? He would also feel wronged if he had to deal with such a troublemaker like Wei Wei Bai. /button. Chapter 1956. But what could he do? He could only wait and love her. He had already dug out his heart, but she was still finding trouble for him. Whether it was worth it or not, or whether he would regret it. He had long regretted meeting her. As long as he could not see her, everything would go smoothly for him. Ever since he met her, he had always been unlucky. He had never had a day of peace. What was he after? To regret it in the future and then abandon her. He must be sick in the head. Wasn't it because he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her? That was why he was so desperate. His gaze was burning, and his eyes were bright and dark. What do I do to make you believe me and like me? You can't be so selfish. Why don't you think about how much I've sacrificed for you when you think about being abandoned? He was a man, but he was trampling on his pride. He was so petty that he would fuss over such trivial matters. He had no self-esteem left. He thought that he could keep quiet. After all, he was a man, and it was okay to give more. But this was not a matter of giving more. This was a matter of life and death. Anyway, he had no face in front of Wei Wei Bai. He was even more shameless. He wanted to collect his debt from her for the rest of his life. Why could she turn a blind eye to him when he had sacrificed so much? It was too unfair. He was more resentful than Do-yi. He wished he could call someone to make artificial snow for Wei Wei Bai to see. Xia Hanyang did not care about his image. When we met, I stayed up late to study every day for you. You know that, right? At that time, I had a net worth of hundreds of millions. I earned it all by myself. I abandoned my business for that damn college entrance exam that was useless to me. I was like a kitten meowing at you every day. I lost hundreds of millions every month just to study intersection and union function formulas. You have to admit it. Wei Wei Bai moved her lips and said with some difficulty, I didn't know you lost so much. Xia Hanyang sneered. What do you know? You only know how to stab me in the heart. You only think about when I'm dead and stop pestering you. These words were too harsh. Wei Wei Bai couldn't take it anymore. The corners of her eyes turned red, and her face was pale. She was so beautiful that Xia Hanyang's heart kept twitching. He didn't want to force her like this. Wouldn't he feel bad if she was in pain? It was unbearable. But she was already depressed. If he didn't get to the main point, she would be able to undo the knot in her heart. If her depression continued to worsen, would she be able to recover? Wasn't this forcing him to his death? The two of them might as well perish together. Xia Hanyang thought fiercely and continued to say in a more serious tone, "You don't have to give me anything, but you feel good because no one can hurt you. You'd rather die than give me your heart. As for me, I've dug out my heart and lungs. I'm just short of holding a knife and begging you to stab me to death. Don't hang me up and torture me like this. My entire youth was buried in your hands. You left just because you said so. If you had any dissatisfaction with me at that time, why did you leave? Tell me. I can't eat, and someone forced water down my throat. Do you know how to force water down my throat? Holding that kind of funnel-like tool and forcefully pouring it down. Wei Bai finally couldn't stand it anymore. She shouted angrily, "Enough, stop talking." Xia Hanyang sneered, "Do you feel sorry for me too? I lost dozens of kilograms in a month. Why didn't you feel sorry for me at that time?" Wei Bai was a little exhausted. Her vision turned black, and her arms were terrifyingly cold. She repeated with trembling lips, almost pleading, "Stop talking, Xia Hanyang, /download the at https://m/sashu.com//. Chapter 1957. Xia Hanyang couldn't suppress his outburst. She didn't want to live a good life with him. What else could he do? Depression was very destructive. She hated him so much that she even suffered from depression when she stayed by his side. Xia Hanyang's heart was broken by her. He pinched her arms hard to prevent her from escaping. He stared at her frightened eyes. "I have to say it. I have to let you know that I've lived a life worse than a dog." After all, she was superior because of him. He was rich and powerful, handsome, and had countless ways to retreat. That was why she didn't like him. What could he do? Disfigure his face or destroy his future to love her? At that time, she would definitely despise him. Thinking about it this way, she was really selfish, pretentious, and scum to the core. She didn't give anything because she was afraid of getting hurt. However, Xia Hanyang didn't care how vicious, selfish, and cruel she was. As long as she didn't run away, she could live a peaceful life with him. She didn't even fulfill such a simple wish, so he didn't pretend to be gentle with her. Xia Hanyang's expression was so ruthless that it was close to cruelty. "Do you know that I've been looking for you every day for the past 6 years? I fucking went to the furthest and most dangerous places to find you. I got into trouble because of you and was almost chopped up. Because it was too painful to think of you, I drank too much and almost got myself sent to the morgue because of alcohol poisoning. I've also suffered from depression. I'm much worse than you. I stabbed myself in the neck with a knife and wished that I could die to be free. I even jumped into the sea. What accident? I did it on purpose." He didn't want his face anymore. He didn't want his self-esteem anymore. She didn't want to live anymore. She wanted him dead. Then what face did he want? Xia Hanyang said word by word, full of hatred, Wei Bai, touch your conscience and tell me, how can I have a way out? I've died countless times. Where is my way out? Wei Bai's eyes were misty, but they were no longer cold and arrogant. Instead, after the layer of indifference was shattered, she revealed helpless pain. She finally spoke in a trembling voice, "I didn't know. I didn't know you were in so much pain, Xia Hanyang." She seemed to be remorseful and desperate. "Why do you have to force yourself like this? I'm not worth it. I'm not worth it at all." Xia Hanyang suddenly showed a tired smile, and his fingers slowly touched her delicate and beautiful face. When he saw her, he really wanted to say something. She had also grown up. What used to be a crisp plum had now grown into a delicate and beautiful flower. The first time they met after reuniting, he smashed the door open. Her ink-black hair fell to her shoulders, and her flawless face that was whiter than snow rushed into his eyes. How beautiful! You see, after being hurt by her for so many years. The first time they met, he was still stunned by her. He loved her so much. What could he do? He was also in despair. What's the use of despising yourself when you love someone so lowly? Didn't he continue to kneel and love her? Xia Hanyang's fingers touched the redness at the corner of her eyes, which was wet. Her eyes were filled with tears. He didn't know if it was because she was scared by him or because she was hurt. He suddenly felt that he was really a jerk. It was all in the past, and he still used it to scare her. At the end of the day, he was the one who did all these shameless things. It had nothing to do with her. Look at how he had forced her to this point with these trivial matters. Xia Hanyang revealed a bitter smile, and his voice softened. Wei Wei, you are my only way out, do you understand? There were countless ways out, and they didn't exist. With that said, he let go of her arm. Chapter 1958. He knew that he was hurting her. It was good to explode once. Otherwise, he would really hurt her when he became completely perverted. He would regret it for the rest of his life. Xia Hanyang felt that he looked ugly. He reached out to cover his face in embarrassment, worried that his tears would burst out. He hurriedly turned around, wanting to leave for a while to calm down. But before he could take 2 steps, the back of his clothes was suddenly pulled. Xia Hanyang paused. He heard Wei Wei Bai muster all her courage and say, "Back then, I liked you, Xia Hanyang." Xia Hanyang's tinnitus was severe. He felt that he was seriously ill. His ears were hallucinating. Her voice was still choked with panic, but more of it was hoarse because she was desperate. At that time, I started to like you, so I wanted to leave you. Xia Hanyang was stunned. He stood there stiffly, not even daring to look back. Along the way, his love had been too petty and painful. His greatest hope was that she would stay by his side calmly and occasionally give him an emotionless smile. He was happy. Wei Wei Bai should never be the one feeling inferior in this relationship. It should be him. Xia Hanyang's fingertips began to numb and tremble with excitement. He said in a hoarse voice, "Don't talk nonsense because of sympathy." If he took it seriously, it would really be over. If she didn't give him hope, he would have nothing to ask for from her. As long as there was a slight possibility that she loved him, his appetite would be like a black hole, eager to devour her. Wei Wei Bai's fingers pinched the corner of his clothes. Her fingernails turned white, and she slowly pressed her head against his back. Every word was light and solemn. "Xia Hanyang, I liked you. At that time, I was scared." She almost cried as she said, "I didn't dare to imagine how I could be with you when I had nothing. I had no choice but to leave." 6 years ago, she was just a few years old. But she was still young. Xia Hanyang now thought about it and knew that they were at that time. They were both equally childish. He loved her wholeheartedly. But he didn't even understand her uneasiness, inferiority, and pain. No wonder people said that first love didn't die a good death. He was a son of AB***, and his love was rough and careless. How could it be so easy to end things well? Serves him right for looking for her for 6 years. Xia Hanyang said in a husky voice, "Don't lie to me." Wei Wei Bai started crying softly. Her tears stained his back. "I can't lie to you. I really don't dare to lie to you, Xia Hanyang. So, Don't hurt yourself like this." Her words were soft and sad. But there was an unwavering determination. Xia Hanyang stared blankly ahead. This dream was so beautiful. How many times had he woken up in the middle of the night to look for her? He was also worried that Wei Wei Bai would suddenly appear and say that she was joking with him. She liked him so much. His dream had come true. However, he suddenly had no reaction at all. Only the sound of her crying rang in his ears. She cried so hard that even a man like him wanted to cry. Xia Hanyang turned around, pressed her lowered head with one hand, and pressed her face against his chest. His other hand also wrapped around her waist. Then he rested his head on her neck, breathing in her fresh and fragile breath. He murmured, "Then do you still like me now?" Wei Wei Bai didn't say anything, but her tears didn't stop. She was silent, and her crying made him feel terrible. Xia Hanyang couldn't help but beg for mercy. "It's okay if you don't like me. It's okay if you don't like me. Just don't cry." He couldn't stand this trick of hers. Suddenly, he paused. He felt a thin layer of clothing on his chest. Her kiss and cold tears were imprinted on his chest. It was a very heavy kiss. Imprinted on his chest, he lost all words. But he heard her whisper, "I like you." Xia Hanyang, ding, the male lead's favorability is at 97. The download address is at https://www.sashu.com. Chapter 1959. After returning from the hospital, Xia Hanyang temporarily postponed his work. He just stayed at home. Depression was a terrible thing. Even in the early stages, the patient could suffer endless torture. Wei Wei Bai was not in a good state. Her whispered words of "like" were like a fragile dream. But it gave him infinite hope. It didn't matter how much she liked him. It was fine as long as she liked him. There was a popular saying on the internet. As long as she took one step, he could take the remaining 99 steps. Xia Hanyang felt that even if Wei Wei Bai only took 1/10 of a step, he could run to her side no matter how many steps were left. In the 6 years that she left, he didn't dare to investigate where she went. Because this period of separation was too heavy. Every time he uncovered it, it tore his heart that had just healed. But Wei Wei Bai's words of love gave him the courage to face those days. With Wei Wei Bai's personality and ability, she couldn't have been so poor. 10 million was enough for her to squander. But when they first met, she was standing in front of him. She had nothing. If it weren't for the 6 years in between. He thought that she hadn't left and still didn't know him. The Wei Wei Bai who had nothing. Even the school uniform was the same. Xia Hanyang even suspected that Wei Wei Bai's self-inflicted inferiority complex could be so heavy. It was all because of these 6 years. He picked up an orange and began to peel it. After Wei Wei Bai confessed, she seemed to be much more relaxed and ate more. Xia Hanyang glanced at her from time to time. Seeing that she was lazily playing mobile games, he didn't say much. She said that she was bored and didn't want to move. Xia Hanyang immediately connected the internet cable. He didn't want to connect so early. After all, if he gave her the internet, she would have more leverage whether she ran away or stayed away from him. In the end, it was her words of love. It made him feel a sense of security. And he couldn't bear to see her in pain. Wei Wei Bai connected to the internet to play a game that was recently popular. Xia Hanyang saw that she was having fun, so he also went up. But he wasn't interested in games, so he didn't play. Early depression was easier to recover from. Xia Hanyang was more experienced in this aspect. He stuffed a piece of orange into her mouth. Wei Wei Bai, who was having fun playing the game, didn't notice that food was being stuffed. Like a cat being fed, she raised her head to look at him. Her expression was indescribably adorable. Then, when the game reached a critical point, she couldn't care less. She didn't protest and continued to play the game while eating the oranges. Then it became Xia Hanyang's turn to feed Tangerine. She played the game. When there were only a few pieces of orange left, he said casually, "You're having so much fun. Haven't you played before?" Bai Weiwei didn't think too much about it. How could I have played it, not to mention games, even books? She was jolted awake almost immediately. Her hand paused, and the character's HP bar was almost emptied. Bai Weiwei returned to her senses and hurriedly used a first aid kit on the character. Xia Hanyang's eyes darkened. Never played the game. She didn't sound like she hadn't played the game before, but she didn't have the chance to play the game at all. Maybe she was too obedient to play the game. After all, Wei Wei Bai was very hardworking and obedient when she was studying. She didn't have any hobbies. Xia Hanyang didn't say anything and continued to feed her the orange. Wei Wei Bai seemed absent-minded. Her character died a few times. Xia Hanyang saw her actions but didn't say anything. Download the https://www.sashu.com/download the full article, https://www.sashu.com download the full article, https://www.sashu.com download the full article, https://sashu.com/. Chapter 1960. And so, the topic came to an end. Wei Wei Bai was relieved that her words didn't arouse any suspicion. She continued to play games on her phone. Xia Hanyang was now obedient to her. As long as she was happy. He picked up his laptop and started to work. Wei Wei Bai glanced at Xia Hanyang. The man's side profile was handsome and cold. Under the light, his silhouette was perfect. His eyes were cold and heavy as he stared at his work. He was so serious that it was depressing. She probably couldn't slack off working under such a person. Wei Wei Bai said to the system casually, "Maybe I have to do something to change Xia Hanyang's opinion of me and let me go out." She tried every means to provoke Xia Hanyang. She made him irritable and finally said what was on his mind. Only then would she have the chance to confess. Xia Hanyang was too guarded. Usually, she would say that she liked him 100 times. When he heard that, he would only lock the door tighter. It wasn't easy to make him believe that she liked him. He immediately pulled the net. But it wasn't appropriate to ask for more now. The system was knitting a woolen hat. He nagged, "Can't you just live a good life? Don't do anything. It's a lifetime. It's better to live a peaceful life. Isn't it just a few years? Get along well with him. After 8 or 10 years, he will believe you." Wei Wei Bai, why did the system sound like a good wife and mother? Did she miss out on some of his growth experiences? Wei Wei Bai smiled while playing games. Xia Hanyang won't doubt me if I don't do anything. I'm waiting for him to ask. These 6 years are enough for me to compete with him. The system silently knitted a hat. You just slept for 6 years. How was it miserable? He had knitted 20 hats, 10 sweaters, and 3 scarves. He had gained 2 days of life points. So, let's not do anything, okay? Knitting sweaters was wonderful. He finished his work at around 10 o'clock. Wei Wei Bai also finished playing games. Xia Hanyang pulled her very calmly and said, "Go to sleep. Get up early tomorrow and go running with me. Wei Wei Bai was a little slow as she blinked her eyes, seemingly unable to understand his words. Running. Xia Hanyang was also very determined. He was afraid that she would run away. This thought caused him great pain. When he locked her up, he felt a sick sense of security. But this is wrong. Xia Hanyang felt that his illness should be treated. Locking her up for the rest of her life, could she get the love she wanted? He couldn't. In the past, he didn't have any expectations and felt that she wouldn't love him even if she didn't shut him down. Even if he couldn't get the heart, it was still good to get the person. He knew that he was such a beast. But now, she had given him some hope. Then he would have the courage to start easing their pattern of interaction. Moreover, her illness also required exercise and external treatment. Bai Weiwei blinked. Originally, there was no spirit in her eyes that appeared lifeless. It lit up at once. It was as if a flower had bloomed in her eyes. The soft light in her eyes was exceptionally gentle. Xia Hanyang's heart relaxed. He felt that being looked at by her like this. His heart was rubbed into a ball, and it was warm. Xia Hanyang tidied up the table. During this time, the nanny wouldn't stay behind except to cook. Some of the housework was done by himself. He washed the dishes, took the slippers, and threw the clothes into the washing machine. When he did these things, it was very smooth and natural. Wei Wei Bai wanted to do it, but he couldn't bear to. Xia Hanyang threw the orange peel into the trash can. Seeing that she was still looking at him with excitement in her eyes, he smiled. At the bottom to record this reading record. Chapter 1961. He paused for a moment. It was so late at night. With great perseverance, Xia Hanyang resisted the impulse and said, "Go to sleep. By the way, do you need me to run the bath water for you?" Wei Wei Bai didn't notice the faint excitement in his tone. She shook her head and immediately got up from the sofa and walked to the room. "No, see you tomorrow." She would say "see you tomorrow" for the first time. Xia Hanyang was stunned. Although his body temperature was still so high, he finally suppressed the thought of being worse than a beast. He said in a hoarse voice, "See you tomorrow." The door was closed. Xia Hanyang slowly exhaled. Damn, he felt that he was going to become an eminent monk. He used to be able to go out for work, but now they were together day and night. He really wished he could castrate himself. He didn't want to scare her. Xia Hanyang's eyes were like a wolf's. He stared at the door of her room for a long time. Then he finally walked to the guest room where he lived. He took a cold shower. Halfway through the cold shower, there was a sudden thunderstorm outside. The weather forecast said there would be a thunderstorm. But he didn't expect it to be at night. Xia Hanyang's lower body was wrapped in a bath towel. He grabbed a towel and wiped his hair vigorously. His skin was cold. It took a long time for the cold water to cool down. Xia Hanyang walked to the wine cabinet and took out a bottle of liquor. He seldom drank now, but occasionally he couldn't suppress the heat and would drink a few glasses. A few glasses couldn't make him drunk, but it could make him sleep. So that he wouldn't be too energetic in the middle of the night and make trouble. After all, he sat in front of Wei Wei Bai's door at 2 or 3 in the morning and stared at her until dawn. He also felt that he was a pervert. Just as he poured half a glass of liquor, there was a knock on the door. Xia Hanyang stopped pouring the liquor and was a little confused. Then he heard a weak knock on the door. This time, it was not wrong. It was not an illusion. His hand trembled and the liquor almost spilled. Xia Hanyang immediately put down the bottle, rushed to the door in a few steps and opened it at once. Seeing that Wei Wei Bai had turned around and was about to leave, he grabbed her hand. Xia Hanyang hurriedly grabbed her arm and asked anxiously, "What's wrong? Why are you knocking on my door?" Wei Wei Bai was pulled by him and staggered. She turned around and her face was pale. Even the little bit of blood on her lip seemed to have been covered in frost, making her look exceptionally spiritless. Wei Wei Bai hesitated for a moment before whispering, "I'm fine." She finished speaking and was about to leave. Xia Hanyang had forcefully dragged her into the sect. There was a loud bang outside the window. Wei Wei Bai was shocked. Her pupils constricted and her face turned even paler. Her expression was tense, and for a moment, she was so frightened that she didn't know how to walk. Xia Hanyang didn't notice it at first, but when he saw the excessive fear on her face, his heart sank. What was going on? She was not afraid of thunder. Xia Hanyang keenly saw that her eyes were red. She was so timid but cute. He hurriedly stopped his shameless thoughts. He pressed his hand on her shoulder and whispered softly, afraid that he would scare her, "What's wrong?" "Afraid of thunder." Wei Wei Bai shook her head with difficulty. "It's okay. I'm not afraid." After saying that, the thunder roared again. Wei Wei Bai held Xia Hanyang's arm tightly and almost hid in his arms. Xia Hanyang immediately took a step forward and let her hide in his arms. He looked at the thunderstorm outside the window and became more and more confused. He stroked her hair. "Don't be afraid. I'm here." Wei Wei Bai had stopped trembling. She quietly held his arm and lowered her head to let him touch her. She was so obedient. /T Chapter 1962. Xia Hanyang felt that she was here to tempt him into committing a crime. He pursed his lips, afraid that he would show his fangs and bite her. He quickly changed the topic. "If you're afraid, you won't be afraid after drinking some wine." Wei Wei Bai looked up, and the fear in her eyes did not fade away. She nodded in agreement. A man and a woman alone in the middle of the night. Xia Hanyang admitted that he was up to no good. He casually stuffed half a glass of wine into Wei Wei Bai's hand. "Don't be afraid. I'll drink with you." After saying that, he pulled her to sit on the bed. Then he poured himself a glass of wine and drank it all in one gulp. When he was drinking, he stole a glance at her, which was unbelievably deep. Wei Wei Bai did not notice, but hesitated for a moment. Seeing that he drank so quickly, she thought that the alcohol content was not high. So she lowered her head and drank one sip after another. This kind of strong liquor was particularly mild. But it was famous for its after effects. Many people fell for it easily. However, in less than half a bottle, a man was knocked out. For Xia Hanyang, a former alcoholic, it was impossible for him to drink. But it was easy for him to knock out Wei Wei Bai. So he did not remind her, but drank one glass after another with her. He drank a lot. She slowly drank more than 2 glasses. For a person who did not drink often, she drank too much. Sure enough, her face began to turn red. It was a rosy red, a red color that was rarely seen on her face. Her eyes were misty, which was different from her nearsighted haze. But it was seductive moist, and the corners of her eyes were red, like peach blossoms. Xia Hanyang felt that he was going to turn into a werewolf on a rainy night. He should pity her for being afraid of thunder. But forgive him for thinking about her for so many years. Thinking about it, his head was full of anger, and so was his heart. He wanted to pounce on her whenever she showed a flaw. Even if it was a kiss. He wanted to kiss her, so much that it hurt everywhere. Xia Hanyang's eyes lit up, and he whispered, "Wei Wei, are you still afraid of thunder?" She drank so much wine. If she didn't get drunk, he would take her surname. Wei Wei Bai shook her head and murmured, I'm going to faint, Xia Hanyang. Xia Hanyang said, that's good. I'm not afraid of thunder if I faint. Bai Wei Wei stared blankly at him, her face sluggish, her eyes wide open. Suddenly, there was a clatter. Tears gushed out of her eyes. She didn't cry out loud either. She just quietly let the tears flow down her cheeks. He looked so pitiful and desperate. As soon as she cried, Xia Hanyang's werewolf impulse disappeared. He immediately turned into a stuttering little dog. Wei Wei. Wei Wei. Some people would behave strangely when they were drunk. However, he had never seen anyone cry as miserably as Wei Wei Bai. Wei Wei Bai did not answer. Instead, her entire body trembled. She bit her lips tightly and cried silently. Another clap of thunder sounded. Wei Wei Bai suddenly threw herself into Xia Hanyang's arms and hugged him tightly. She trembled and said, I'm scared, Xia Hanyang. Xia Hanyang hurriedly hugged her and reached out to stroke her back. His face suddenly darkened, and his eyes were full of anxiety. Don't be afraid. She was not afraid of thunder. Why was she suddenly so afraid of thunder? Wei Wei Bai suddenly whispered, they were struck by lightning. It's so scary. Xia Hanyang was stunned. Struck by lightning. Wei Wei Bai cried silently. Her voice trembled so much that she couldn't form a sentence. They wanted to escape. They were struck by lightning. Xia Hanyang was at a loss for a long time. He didn't understand this sentence at all. Escape. Struck by lightning. It sounded like the plot of a story. The download address is at https://www.sashu.com. Chapter 1963. Did she drink too much? Xia Hanyang tried to comfort her. It's okay. Isn't it someone else who was struck by lightning? Our Wei Wei is so kind and beautiful. Even if I was struck by lightning, it wouldn't strike you. Perhaps she felt that she had abandoned him. She felt guilty. That was why she was so afraid of lightning. One couldn't do anything against their conscience. Once they did something, they were afraid of lightning. Xia Hanyang worked hard for a long time. Finally, the rain outside stopped a little. Wei Wei Bai burped, hung dizzily on his strong arm, and closed her eyes to sleep. Her face was red, and her appearance was indescribably seductive. Xia Hanyang stared at her bitterly for a long time. Then he was sure that she was really asleep. So she came here just to cry and then go to sleep. What about him? He would rather be struck by lightning than suffer this torture. Xia Hanyang put her soft body on the bed and supported her with one hand. In this position, she was completely enveloped by his body. She was unconscious, and her hair was so long that it covered the bed. He had once imagined the way her hair would be long and spread out beneath his body. It would definitely look good. Now he was sure again. She was really beautiful. Xia Hanyang couldn't help but touch her hair for a long time, and then he touched her face. Her eyelashes were closed, and her lips. In the end, Xia Hanyang was still gasping for breath and lay down heavily beside Wei Wei Bai. Then he hugged her. There was a glimmer of light in his eyes, and there was a hint of laziness like a big cat. Then he had time to think about Wei Wei Bai's words. She was afraid of lightning, but it was definitely not because of her school days. Some things happened during the 6 years of her disappearance, which caused her to be traumatized by thunderstorms. Xia Hanyang muttered to himself, lightning killed someone and then escape. His pupils constricted, and he realized what it meant to escape. The place where people escaped was imprisonment. Why would she use this word? Could it be that she was imprisoned by someone? Xia Hanyang's heart sank, and he suppressed this crazy idea. But investigating her life during the past 6 years became the most urgent thing in his heart. Wei Wei Bai woke up with a splitting headache. She missed the run as she wished. The wine was frighteningly strong. She only remembered that in the middle of the night, Xia Hanyang gave her some tea to sober her up. He also forced her to eat some porridge. After all, not eating and drinking too much wine was not good for the body. Bai Weiwei asked the system in a daze, "There were no accidents last night, right?" The system held the knitting needle and nodded, "You said it yourself. It's just that the story of being struck to death by lightning doesn't make sense." Bai Weiwei covered her head. Did she say that people were struck by lightning? Being struck to death by lightning was only one of them. Was. Calm automatically correct data automatically. Data automatically. Did I also break out? System. No. You were only released for a short time because of your good behavior. So the data update changed to you being held hostage. When you came to the outer iron fence, you saw the escapee being struck by lightning. Otherwise, there was no way to explain how she saw the escapee. After all, the prisoners at night were all locked up. Wei Wei Bai rubbed her temples. She said, "You've worked hard. I have to think of a way to let Xia Hanyang investigate the process himself." // Chapter 1964. If she said it herself, she would not be so touched. The truth that Xia Hanyang found out by himself was enough for him to let her go. It was noon when Wei Wei Bai woke up. The nanny rushed over with hangover soup and a hot towel. The nanny said, "The young master went to work early and asked me to come and take care of you." Wei Wei Bai knew that Xia Hanyang had gone to investigate. After all, during this time, he had pushed away the social engagements outside and spent time at home with her with work. She felt that she was about to be free. Wei Wei Bai was in a good mood when she thought of this and untied the knot in her heart. Nothing had happened in this plane. So she ate an extra bowl of rice. The nanny was grinning from ear to ear. After all, as long as Wei Wei Bai ate and slept well, she was in a good mood. Everything was fine with Xia Hanyang. The Xia family doted on Xia Hanyang and Wei Wei Bai, who could control Xia Hanyang's mood. They also served him with trepidation. Xia Hanyang did not appear for the whole day. Wei Wei Bai was not in a hurry. After all, she just gave Xia Hanyang a general direction. Xia Hanyang might not realize it on the first day. She had been in prison before. Maybe he would investigate for a few more days. It was almost dinner time. The system suddenly threw the sweater in its hand and said seriously, "Host, go to the top floor quickly. The machine has 1 minute of fuel to go back. It will start in 10 minutes. You only have 1 minute." In the spare box of the machine, there was 1 minute of fuel to go back. As long as Wei Wei Bai's soul quickly entered the passage in this 1 minute, he could take her back. You don't have to wait for a lifetime. The system urged. Wei Wei Bai also got up in an instant and said hurriedly, "What, are you sure?" The system said, "In 10 minutes, the top floor will open. You can just jump down directly." Wei Wei Bai said, "Fuck, why are you in such a hurry for such a good thing?" It was good news that she did not have to stay for a lifetime. Wei Wei Bai saw the nanny enter the kitchen. During this time, the nanny was not on guard against her. After all, she had been so obedient for 2 months. Except for Xia Hanyang, everyone would relax their vigilance. Wei Wei Bai looked at the clothes rack at the door. The nanny's shoulder bag was hanging on it. She got up carefully. She didn't even wear shoes. She crouched down and searched for the key in the shoulder bag. Then, he opened the door and closed it silently. She locked the nanny in the door. Without Xia Hanyang's fingerprints, the door couldn't be opened. Wei Wei Bai rushed to the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. The system also reminded her, the male lead is coming back. Wei Wei Bai asked, where is he? The system replied, he's still on the road. It'll take him more than 10 minutes to get back here. Wei Wei Bai nodded. There's still time. When they reached the top floor, the wind was extremely strong. Wei Wei Bai stood barefooted on the edge of the balcony. The system roared, there are still 3 minutes before it opens. Don't jump now, okay? Otherwise, I'll really become a spirit behind you. Wei Wei Bai grabbed onto the surrounding barbed wire and shouted, got it. Remind me when the time is up. The system said, okay, I'll go check the time. I'll remind you when it's time. Wei Wei Bai stood on the edge of the balcony, trembling. It was too high and her legs were weak. 3 minutes felt extremely long. Before the time was up, a car suddenly appeared downstairs and drove from afar. The speed was as if it was on a date with the Grim Reaper. Wei Wei Bai took a look. It seemed to be Xia Hanyang's car. The nanny had a cell phone. He knew that she had run away. Wei Wei Bai calculated the distance and time. Damn it. If she jumped, she would either die in front of him or hit his car. Chapter 1965. She didn't know why, but her mind suddenly flashed. The scene of him exploding in the hospital. Bai Weiwei rarely showed emotional fluctuations like an old woman. Because of the blocker, it was almost impossible for her to have any emotional fluctuations towards the people in this world. But she didn't know why. When the car rushed over from afar with all its might and disregard everything else. Suddenly, Xia Hanyang's young face, full of youthful and wanton smiles, flashed in her mind. If she didn't exist, his life wouldn't be so tragic. The current Xia Hanyang had too many tragic scars left behind in his eyes. When he smiled, he was no longer so carefree and wanton. 6 years had left him with indelible pain. Wei Wei Bai frowned a little strangely. Why did she think of this? She had never felt emotional fluctuations before. It was faint, with an almost insignificant strength. It fell lightly into her heart. Just when she and the system didn't notice. The red line on her wrist flashed a golden light and became fuller. The system said, okay, it's opened. You have to step into the passage in 1 minute. Jump off the building now. Wei Wei Bai didn't think much and just stepped out with 1 foot. The car just stopped. A battered figure almost fell out of the car. He staggered to his feet and ran as fast as he could into the building. His flying black hair was messed up in the wind. She couldn't see his face clearly, but just by looking at his body, she knew how desperate and painful he was. Wei Wei Bai suddenly couldn't help but think. She would just jump down like this. Her body would definitely fall in front of Xia Hanyang. A strange thought appeared in Wei Wei Bai's mind. The man who saw her jump off the building. He would die. Xia Hanyang would definitely die. Xia Hanyang didn't sleep all night. His mind was full of what she said. He looked at her all night. In the end, he couldn't stand it anymore. He didn't know what she had been through. He left early, ran to the company, and brought out the entire information department. Investigate, he had to find out where she had been for the past 6 years. If she didn't say, could he pretend not to know? He was busy with this for most of the day. However, he was very clear about her information. After she disappeared 6 years ago, she didn't study or go abroad. Also, she had taken away 10 million yuan, but there was no woman with a lot of money who suddenly appeared. 10 million was neither too much nor too little. For an ordinary person, buying a house would leave traces behind. Only Wei Wei Bai did not leave any trace behind. Xia Hanyang suddenly thought of the news of Wei Wei Bai being struck by lightning. He frowned and ordered someone to check the news. Being struck to death by lightning was definitely news. After all, it was considered a rare and novel way to die. With great difficulty, he finally found a very inconspicuous piece of news in an old newspaper from 3 years ago. It was a prison. 5 prisoners escaped from the prison, taking advantage of the thunderstorm to escape. To successfully escape, they even held hostage a prisoner who was usually bullied by them. He threatened the prison guards. Just as they were about to kill and escape, thunderstorm's lightning just happened to fall on the outer barbed wire fence. One of the 3 prisoners who had already climbed up the barbed wire was killed on the spot. 2 of them were seriously injured. The other 2 hostage-takers were restrained by the prison guards. The hostage-taker was very calm and even held the other prisoners back. In addition, he usually behaved well in prison. He had a chance to get a reduced sentence. When Xia Hanyang first saw this news, he didn't feel anything. Fast. Chapter 1966. He didn't even mention Wei Wei Bai at all. After all, how could his Wei Wei go to jail? What was prison? He knew. Not to mention a girl, even those criminals who were full of evil would go to jail. They were all afraid. Xia Hanyang found that his fingers holding the newspaper were trembling. He took a deep breath. He hadn't found out yet. It wasn't necessarily Wei Wei Bai. No, it wasn't her. Xia Hanyang searched for this piece of news and found nothing but this. He hesitated for a long time and was about to order someone to investigate this news when his phone rang. It was Third Master Xia. After he found Wei Wei Bai, he had been guarding against Old Master Xia. 6 years ago, if he hadn't come out to make trouble, Wei Wei Bai wouldn't have left him. Maybe Old Master Xia wouldn't have covered up the news when she left for a month. He wouldn't have looked in the wrong direction and lost her completely. He was still resentful about this. Xia Hanyang answered the phone and was about to say that he was busy. But Old Master Xia said in a deep voice, "Come here. I have something to tell you." Xia Hanyang said, "Grandpa, I'm very busy." Old Master Xia was silent for a while and sighed, "It's about Wei Wei Bai." Xia Hanyang immediately got up, picked up his coat with one hand and walked out. What happened to her? Old Master Xia hesitated for a few seconds and said, "She has been in prison for the past 6 years." Xia Hanyang was almost unprepared. This sentence broke the expression on his face. He stood there blankly. He didn't know how much time had passed before he heard his own voice tremble from the cold. "I'll come to your place right away. Give me the information." After that, he hung up the phone and couldn't wait to throw it out. He was afraid that she would call him and ask why he didn't take her out for a run. So at the last second, he put the phone back in his pocket. Then he kicked the chair in front of him and hurried back to the old house. When Xia Hanyang arrived, Old Master Xia gave him the information. He pressed Xia Hanyang's hand and seemed to have aged a few years. In the end, Xia San couldn't help but sigh, "She's a good child. Treat her well." Hearing this, Xia Hanyang couldn't help but feel bitterly disappointed. What kind of treatment did Wei Wei Bai receive that even the cold-hearted Old Master Xia would sympathize with her? Xia Hanyang didn't know how much courage he had. She flipped through the files of the 6 years she had spent in prison. She turned herself in. He had clearly helped her keep the murder a secret. However, after the college entrance exam, she seemed to have fulfilled her wish. She abandoned him and turned herself in. She had returned to her hometown to turn herself in. Because of her good behavior, the local court's verdict was closed during the trial. Therefore, there was no news, and no information was leaked. When they were researching, they had never thought about this. Xia Hanyang even forgot how that beast of a stepfather had died. After all, this wasn't a big deal to him. No one thought that Wei Wei Bai would give up such a good future to go to jail. No wonder he couldn't find out where she went. Xia Hanyang's fingers hurt as he flipped through the documents, as if needles were pricking his fingernails. How could his Wei Wei go to such a place? She was too obedient and too arrogant. If she went to such a place, she would have no relatives outside and no one would help her. She would be bullied to death. Xia Hanyang's eyes were red, and his expression was extremely violent. She was too good, so she was bullied. Chapter 1967. They beat her and insulted her. He couldn't imagine how such a disgusting word as bitch and vixen could be related to Wei Wei Bai. And she had suffered countless such physical violence for so many years. Xia Hanyang's expression was very scary. He gritted his teeth so hard that blood overflowed. The old Chinese medicine doctor beside Master Xia looked at him. He was furious. He immediately came over and grabbed Xia Hanyang's jaw, forcing him to loosen his teeth for fear that he would break his gums. Xia Hanyang pushed the old Chinese medicine doctor away and loosened his teeth, saying, "I want them to die." Master Xia frowned. "Calm down, Yang Yang." Xia Hanyang roared, "How can I calm down? How can I calm down? Why didn't I think of this? Why didn't I find her earlier? I'm a fucking waste. I threw her into prison for 6 years. What did 6 years mean? It was the most beautiful youth and the best years. It was all wasted." Xia Hanyang clutched the documents, his eyes bloodshot with anger and pain. "I threw her into such a place, and I resented her for 6 years. He held his sweetheart in the palm of his hand. He wished he could kneel down and put on her shoes and tie her shoelaces for her. She dug out the softest piece of flesh from the tip of his heart. He wished he could die, but he couldn't bear to hurt her. But she was pressed into the mud, abused and bullied for 6 years. No wonder she was afraid of thunder. She was the one who was bullied and held hostage. If she hadn't dealt with it calmly, she would have died. If it hadn't been for the thunderstorm, he would have only seen her grave." Xia Hanyang accumulated 6 years of anger, pain, despair and violence in his heart. He exploded. He smashed the living room of the old house. He almost hysterically scolded himself. "Why didn't I think of this? Why didn't I think of this? He deserved it when she left him 6 years ago. If he had found out earlier that she blamed herself and was afraid. If he had found out earlier that the terrible shadow of her stepfather's death hadn't disappeared. Then she wouldn't have left so easily. No wonder she had always been indifferent to him. Because she had already decided to leave him after the college entrance examination." Xia Hanyang could hardly imagine how scared she was when she turned herself in alone. However, he didn't feel the slightest bit of her feelings. 6 years later, he met her who had just been released from prison. She even wanted to kill him. Of course, she had nothing. She could only wear the school uniform. Because she had been cut off from the world for 6 years, how could she have anything? Xia Hanyang thought of her depression during this time and how she kept saying that she was not worth it. All his doubts were suddenly cleared. She had been tortured for 6 years, and her arrogance was gone. There was only misery and pain all over his body. Of course, she was afraid of thunder because she had almost died in a thunderstorm. He had even seen others die from lightning strikes with his own eyes. Old Master Xia looked a little sad, but he let Xia Hanyang vent. When Xia Hanyang finally calmed down, Master Xia finally took out a book. The book had been around for a long time, and it was slightly yellow due to lack of maintenance. Do you still remember when I gave her 10 million yuan back then? Xia Hanyang looked at the book in a daze. But when the old man flipped through the pages, he saw 3 checks. This is, Old Master Xia said, because you found her. I wondered why she didn't cash the checks back then and went to investigate. //T. Chapter 1968. Xia Hanyang looked at the book and suddenly remembered something. This was the book that Wei Wei Bai often took back then. It was for reviewing physics. She reviewed for him, afraid that he wouldn't understand. She had always been taking notes. And this book was also one of the books that she took notes on. Old Master said, "You sealed that room, but the books inside were not touched." I went to look at the surveillance video again and found that she put the check in the book. I went to look for it and found it. It wasn't that they didn't see her putting the check in the book. But no one thought that there were so many checks. Wei Wei Bai didn't take the book with her at all. Instead, she put the book on the bookshelf. So in the beginning, they all looked in the wrong direction. So they couldn't find her. Because of a freak combination of factors, the 2 of them missed 6 years. Xia Hanyang looked at the 3 checks and the book with her handwriting on it. Finally, he said in a hoarse voice, "So back then, she didn't leave because of money or because she didn't like me?" Old Master Xia looked at his grandson, and his eyes suddenly became a little wet. "That's why I said that she was a good child. A good child who never intended to avoid responsibility. She made a mistake. Even if it was because she encountered something unfair, she had to fight back." Wei Wei Bai also took this mistake and finished the college entrance examination. Then she turned herself in. Even under that kind of situation, she still tutored this disappointing grandson of hers to make him better. Xia Hanyang's talent in business in recent years was not because Wei Wei Bai had sorted out the learning methods for him. The reason why he went further. Old Master Xia felt that he was really old. Back then, if he had helped Wei Wei Bai instead of driving her away, maybe she wouldn't have left so quickly, or showed a sign of turning herself in. In that case, she wouldn't have had to endure such a painful 6 years alone. If she didn't intend to avoid responsibility in the beginning, then even if she liked Xia Hanyang, she couldn't show it. Xia Hanyang's strength was gone. He crouched down and buried his head in his knees in the messy living room. Like a child who hadn't grown up yet, he was trembling all over. He said, "Grandfather, I hate myself." What kind of bullying did she suffer? What kind of bullying did she suffer to make her feel so inferior and pitiful? "I love her, but I hate myself." Xia Hanyang squatted there with tears streaming down his face. Old Master Xia looked at him for a long time and suddenly reached out to pat him on the shoulder. "Then go back and accompany her. Accompany her through this most difficult time. As a man, you should also take responsibility. Just like Bai Weiwei, for the sake of her own mistakes, she paid 6 years to take responsibility. Such a girl. It was Xia Hanyang who didn't deserve her." Xia Hanyang wiped his tears and stood up. "I'm going back." He would go back to her. Old Master Xia said, "Go ahead. Bring her back when you're free and call me Grandpa." Without hesitation, Xia Hanyang ran out. He had never run so fast before. He was desperate to return to her side. His phone rang, but he ignored it. He drove to the building and ran desperately up the stairs. Even the elevator was too slow for him. When he reached the door of the house, he panted and reached out to open the door. He, who was in a sorry state, forced a smile that was unpleasant to look at. Wei Wei, I'm back. But only the nanny was in the living room. The nanny was holding the phone anxiously. And the phone in his pocket kept ringing. Xia Hanyang didn't answer the phone at all. When the nanny saw him, she immediately said, "Young master, Miss is missing." Xia Hanyang's mind went blank with a bang. Chapter 1969. The nanny was a little scared when she saw Xia Hanyang's face. She hurriedly said, "Just now, she took my keys and suddenly rushed out. She even locked the door." Xia Hanyang looked at the living room blankly and then stepped back. She ran away again. Just like 6 years ago, he opened the door with joy. But suddenly found that she was gone. That feeling of emptiness from being struck by despair destroyed his entire life. Xia Hanyang retreated to the door and slammed it after he went out. He leaned against the door and forced himself to calm down. She couldn't have run far. He was no longer as young as he was 6 years ago. He was sure that he could find her. He wanted to find her and tell her that he knew he was wrong. It wasn't that she left him. It was that he lost her. Xia Hanyang's mind was full of plans to find her, but he couldn't move. He leaned against the door and his brain was still buzzing. His face had never been so pale, which made him look extremely haggard. His fingers trembled as he ran them through his hair. It seemed that only this kind of meaningless action could calm him down. But the scene of her leaving reminded him of the desperate nightmare 6 years ago. Xia Hanyang stared at the stairs in a daze. It seemed that she would come back in the next moment. After a long time, he suddenly woke up and immediately went to get his phone. He finally had the strength to move and look for her. But his movements were too hasty. His hand trembled, and the phone slipped out and was thrown more than a meter away by him. Xia Hanyang quickly lowered his head to get it. But he heard the sound of the elevator door opening. He didn't think much about it. He just picked up his phone and dialed his assistant's number. "Get over here." "Looking for her." "Who are you looking for?" "Who else can it be?" "My wife." He spoke so hurriedly that his lips were cut by his teeth. Suddenly, he paused. A pair of feet without shoes came to him. The toes under the ankles were stained with dust. But the ankles were delicate and fragile like thin and brittle jade. Xia Hanyang still lowered his head. He didn't change his posture of holding the phone. His assistant kept asking him questions. But he couldn't hear a word. Suddenly, a voice like the sound of nature sounded. "Xia Hanyang, are you looking for someone?" Xia Hanyang slowly raised his eyes. The bright lights in the corridor suddenly shone brightly in his eyes. Wei Wei Bai was dressed in home clothes. She seemed to have walked a long way barefooted before finally returning to his side. Her eyes were calm and bright, and that wisp of mist was as clean as the morning dew. She seemed to think that he looked very silly. Wei Wei Bai couldn't help but smile. His eyebrows were relaxed, and there was a hint of relaxed vitality. Xia Hanyang loosened his fingers and the phone fell to the ground, cracking the screen. He took a few steps forward and opened his arms to embrace her. Time suddenly came to a halt. It was as if the world had stopped moving at this moment. Xia Hanyang's eyes were red as he whispered, "You're back, Wei Wei." This sentence passed through 6 years. He finally said it. 6 years ago, when he opened the door, he did not see her. He shouted, "Wei Wei, I'm back." But she left. Wei Wei Bai's fingers seemed to be hesitant, but in the end, they fell on his back and hugged him. Then her voice was gentle and calm, "Yes, Xia Hanyang." The system asked, "Why don't you return to reality?" Wei Wei Bai was bending over to put on her sneakers. Xia Hanyang wanted to take her to exercise. When she heard the system's words, she paused and tied her shoelaces wrongly. // to make it easier for you to read next time, you can click the button, the. Chapter 1970. Xia Hanyang, who was holding a bag of badminton rackets, had just walked into the living room. Seeing her actions, he immediately said, "Let me do it." Then he put down the things temporarily, bent down on one knee, reached out to pick up her messy shoelaces, tidied them up and tied a beautiful bow. Wei Bai looked at Xia Hanyang's spinning hair and couldn't help but respond to the system. Maybe this plane is so relaxing that it's like a vacation. A vacation is never too long. What she didn't say was. At that time, standing on the roof, she thought of her body falling down. After Xia Hanyang saw it with his own eyes, he couldn't live. She didn't know why she couldn't step out. At that time, she thought that if he entered the building, he would return to reality before the time was up. But at the last moment when he ran into the building, she only hesitated for 3 seconds. The passage was closed. This was the first time that Bai Weiwei had hesitated for the sake of a plane partner. She looked at Xia Hanyang deeply. Xia Hanyang had already tied his shoelaces. He looked up and said with a smile, "Okay, let's go." Wei Bai still didn't feel anything in her heart. She was puzzled as to why she was hesitating. It dissipated. Maybe this plane was really like a vacation, so she didn't reject it. After convincing her Wei Bai, she happily followed Xia Hanyang to exercise. But the system silently put down the sweater, then rolled up its sleeves, pulled out the tool and came to the shield. It checked the shield carefully with a cold face. There were no gaps. All the places that should be fixed were fixed. And a machine to destroy feelings was added. So even if a lot of Wei Bai's feelings were hidden in the shield, it was not as excited as it was in the previous planes. There was a danger of cracks in the shield. Then why did Wei Bai suddenly sympathize with Xia Hanyang? This was simply unreasonable. The system felt that it seemed to have overlooked something. It should have blocked all feelings. It couldn't see any fault, so it had to strengthen the shield. Then it continued to knit. Maybe the host really wanted a vacation. The host in this plane was really living a relaxed and happy life. Xia Hanyang treated her like a little princess. Wei Bai was not in good health, so Xia Hanyang personally cooked the medicinal soup. The old Chinese doctor gave him a prescription to soak his feet. Xia Hanyang didn't miss a single day. He boiled the medicinal water and gently washed her feet. Sometimes, when Wei Bai wanted to do something, Xia Hanyang's face darkened. In his eyes, Wei Bai, who was in poor health, looked like she couldn't even walk 2 steps. Xia San even personally came to apologize to Wei Bai. Wei Bai did not dare to accept it. Xia Hanyang said with a cold face, "He deserves it." What kind of grandson is this? A debt collector? Or an unworthy descendant? After that, the two of them got married. A lively wedding was held without a hitch. When Xia Hanyang proposed a toast at his wedding, he invited more than 100 people, including his childhood friend. He drank from everyone he saw. He toasted everyone he saw. In the end, if his sidekick hadn't whispered, "Brother Xia, are you going to lie flat on your wedding night?" Xia Hanyang estimated that he would have drunk with people for 3 days and 3 nights. Then on the wedding night, the system indicated that it was blocked for a day and a night. Facing the civilized, rich and powerful bullet screen, he knitted 2 hats and a pair of socks with no expression on his face. He also ate a bag of small biscuits. Their married life was blissful. But they didn't have children. At first, Xia Hanyang thought about going for a physical checkup or a test tube. Later, the old Chinese doctor said that Wei Wei Bai was in poor health and it might be dangerous for her to have children. Xia Hanyang immediately dismissed the idea. Not having children could not be an obstacle to them. For Xia Hanyang, he saw Wei Wei Bai beside him every day when he woke up. He wouldn't trade with the whole world. Later, he took her to travel around the world. Later, when they stopped traveling, Xia Hanyang followed Wei Wei Bai to learn how to play chess, read books, fish, and grow flowers. For such a hot-tempered person like him, it was incredible that he could do these things carefully. But every time she was with her, he was so happy that he could do anything. Many years later, Wei Wei Bai walked slowly because her shoelaces were loose. Xia Hanyang gently bent his knees and joked, "I'm old. I can't tie your shoelaces for you." Bai Weiwei lifted his chin and smiled, the light in her eyes like stars filling the sky. "How are you old? You're still as handsome as ever." Xia Hanyang couldn't help but smile, his eyes gentle and hot. Just like when they first met, he was young and unscathed. Chapter 1971. The system carried Wei Wei Bai's soul, who had successfully retreated, and carefully avoided the spacetime storm. Then it flew to the entrance of reality. It didn't dare to continue walking. The red line on Wei Wei Bai's body was frighteningly obvious. The golden light was faintly flowing, with a strange and deep power. His flames couldn't break it. This power made the system feel uncomfortable, maybe it had the meaning of evil imprisonment. So it felt that the golden power on the red line was very dangerous. The system carried Wei Wei Bai's soul in circles, but it couldn't keep it from returning to reality. Although he weakened Wei Wei Bai's memory of the plane, and she was tired from living in the plane for a long time. But her state would still be very tired. This kind of tiredness couldn't be changed. The system paused for a while, and suddenly took out a wool doll. This wool was the magic wool produced by the wool factory. After he handed in the sweater hat, there was a little left, so he casually weaved a wool doll according to Wei Wei Bai's appearance. He originally wanted to decorate it nicely as a souvenir. The magic on this wool doll could be stained with the aura of longing. When he was weaving the doll, he was thinking of Wei Wei Bai. Then this doll would be stained with a lot of Wei Wei Bai's aura. The system weighed the doll, and its eyes hardened. It could only try. He hugged Bai Weiwei's soul and reinforced the two flame chains while he was at it. He was afraid that the soul would accidentally leave his palm. The system silently gathered power, and then rushed to the entrance of reality like an explosion. At the edge of the black and gold, a huge power appeared. The system threw the doll at the golden edge. The power at the sea of blood and the mountain of bones suddenly stopped. It seemed to be attracted by something. The power on the red line loosened, and this small pause. The system seized the opportunity, and he rushed into the door of reality and disappeared. The door of reality closed, isolating the power of the red line. In the endless darkness, a hand appeared, cutting through the darkness. The elegant white jade-like joints, the flawless back of the hand, with a kind of power that could break the sky and open the earth. Pushing through the darkness. Suddenly, the strength of his fingers became lighter. The lonely doll lay on the border of darkness. He touched it with his fingertips and then gently picked it up. A doll suddenly appeared in the palm of the man sitting on the bone throne. The doll was very delicate. It was made of knitted wool and had a small flower on its head. A faint magic power surrounded the doll. There was a familiar aura around the magic power. Was it that soul? The man whose eyes were half closed and completely indifferent moved his eyelashes slightly. A ripple appeared in the golden eyes. Then, he closed his eyes again and gently bent his fingers to let the doll lie in his palm. It was doll's aura. It was very comfortable. The system was cursing in its heart. At least it managed to fool him for once. But in her heart, she was cursing Yi Yuxuan. He had already told her not to tie a red string around Wei Wei Bai. Was he deaf? He had caused the death of Wei Wei Bai. He was going to make Yi Yuxuan pay with his life. That lunatic. He hadn't collected all the emotional fragments yet. He couldn't wait to reveal his sick, dark, and paranoid side. Although he knew that people like Yi Yuxuan were born strong and had heaven-defying luck, they were destined to be the protagonists. But their flaws were also very obvious. In this kind of person's personality, their actions were stronger than anyone else's. They were also much more possessive and paranoid than ordinary people. //T. Chapter 1972. As a result, once you want to fight for something, you will fight to the death. The system scolded Yi Yuxuan while carefully looking around and found that Yi Yuxuan was asleep. He immediately put Wei Wei Bai's soul back. Then he retracted back into the trash can to hide. The last time he was forced to meet Yi Yuxuan, he had a sense of crisis. So he would not meet him if he could. Yi Yuxuan, who was sleeping, seemed to notice something. His eyelashes trembled, and his fingers could not help but bend, as if he was holding something. But there was only air in his palm. He finally opened his eyes and looked at the white ceiling of the hospital. Qin Qiu, who was next to him, threw away the medical record and finally breathed a sigh of relief. You finally passed the critical period. Yi Yuxuan gently put his finger to his thin lips, and there was a trace of displeasure in his dark and calm eyes. This action signaled Qin Qiu not to speak too loudly. Qin Qiu's mouth trembled, and he immediately glanced at Wei Wei Bai. Today was the third day. So Wei Wei Bai was likely to wake up. Yi Yuxuan was afraid of waking her up. Yi Yuxuan calmly lowered his voice and said, "Push the wheelchair, I want to take her home." He was hospitalized for the past 3 days. But even if he was hospitalized, he had to put an extra bed in the ward and personally watch over Wei Wei Bai. Qin Qiu knew what he meant. He still couldn't help but jump. "I won't tell your darling that you had food poisoning and almost died, but next time you must not eat Wei Wei's food." It was like being struck by lightning. What happened 3 days ago was still vivid in his mind. If it weren't for Qin Qiu, early the next morning, he would have gone to see Wei Wei Bai's physical condition. Yi Yuxuan could have been directly poisoned to death. Although it was an exaggeration when he opened the door. Seeing Yi Yuxuan lying in front of the table, in a coma with a livid face, he was scared out of his wits. Later, he checked and found that Wei Wei Bai's pudding contained some strange things such as bleach powder. Wait, why would there be bleach powder in the pudding, something that could poison people? After dragging Yi Yuxuan to the hospital to wash his stomach. When Qin Qiu went back to get Yi Yuxuan's clothes, he checked the kitchen. The bleach powder was placed in an inconspicuous corner by the nanny when she was cleaning the stains on the kitchen floor. Because it was relatively small, it was placed in an empty bottle without a label. So, Wei Wei Bai may have added it to the pudding. At that moment, Qin Qiu felt that in the future, whoever let Bai Wei Wei go into the kitchen alone might die. No one could guarantee that they wouldn't have detergent, stain remover, and the like in their kitchen. In Bai Wei Wei's eyes, these things might not be cleaned. But the seasoning, hee. What was even more strange was how Yi Yuxuan ate so much pudding. Wei Wei Bai made a lot of pudding. Yi Yuxuan ate them one by one, just like that. After washing his stomach, Qin Qiu couldn't help but ask him, "Damn, the taste of that pudding must be terrible. You ate one and you knew you were going to be poisoned. Why did you continue to eat?" Yi Yuxuan's face was pale, but his tone was very calm. "Wei Wei made it for me. Although the taste is a bit lacking, it's actually not bad. Not bad your head. Eating one may not be a problem. But knowing that these things can poison people, he still ate them all. Yi Yuxuan's brain was corroded by the bleach powder. Read the full text. Download the full text. Read the full text. Collection below to record the reading record. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.